Buy my book. By the way, while we're waiting to start, I tried to turn on noise suppression. I've been playing around with that a bit, so hopefully my air conditioner won't be in the background. Does it sound any better? Is my voice coming in okay, or is it messed up? Is it I don't know. Let me just see, take a look on my end. Just we'll start in a couple minutes. Okay, that actually sounds pretty good. Okay, well there we go. It's you learn something new every day. So it's some boomer tech. Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a professional. I'm a professional streamer. That's what I do for a living. So we'll get into this in a minute. Today I am drinking President's Choice sparkling ginger ale. I drank some coffee earlier because I wanted to try to be relatively high energy for this. It's been a slow week at work, so I needed something to try to get myself up and going for this. Just once again, just some kind of cleanup before we get into the actual thing. I don't think there's going to be an episode of Enduring Ideal this week. There just hasn't been that much to talk about. Like a lot of stuff is happening, but I just feel like I'd be uh re repeating myself. A lot of it's just trends that have already been going on. So, uh, no, it's not San Pellegrino. This is President's Choice because I'm Canadian. What do you think, Rain? Answer me when I talk to you. Okay, Rain's just ignoring me. So I'm just gonna run to the bathroom and then we'll start at 10 minutes. So in 4 minutes. Hello, everybody, and welcome to my 10th anniversary of Gamergate special. Now, as I think I've said in the past, I honestly wasn't really involved in Gamergate. I was already interested in politics before then, and I was kind of more interested in like EdRX stuff and like early alt-right stuff and something like that. So when Gamergate happened, it just wasn't something I was particularly interested in. It just seemed really kind of lame to me, and I wasn't super involved with it. It has proved though to be an endless source of memes. The fact that Justo came out against Gamergate is amazing. The sheer amount of salt that it generated, the whole like meme about gamers being the most oppressed race. There was so many like amazing things that came out of Gamergate. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to take another look at this. Now, I'm not super familiar with all of the movie Bob lore. I've come across it periodically across the years, but this was movie Bob's book. This was his magnum opus. I like to describe this as being somewhere between a suicide note and a desperate cry for help. If I was a parent and I found my son had written this book, I would try to get him committed, to be perfectly honest. So he made this just before Gamergate started, I think. Gamergate was in 2024, and this came out in, I think, 2023. Let's see what it say in the copyright. Yep, 2013. Sorry, not 2023, 2013. So yeah, this is 11 years old. So a little bit before Gamergate, but very close, very close. And I think it kind of summarizes a lot of things. So this will be interesting to go back and take a look at this. I was watching some of my old video today because I did a complete read through of this a year. Well, not a complete because I skipped parts because it gets really fucking boring. So we'll see. My audio setup, while still shit, is less shit than it was back then. So hope we will like it. Now, the previous read through I did of this was 6 years ago. People were asking me to cover Movie Bob, and people were asking me to do something related to Gamergate. So I think we're going to do this. And now, without further rambling, I present to you Movie Bob's magnum opus. Brick by brick, the greatest, the levels, the enemies, the history of the greatest game ever made. Now, is Super Mario Super Mario Brothers 3 the greatest game ever made? I would personally say no. If I had to pick the greatest game ever made, I'd probably go with Alpha Centauri, or maybe Civ 2, or maybe Ocarina of Time. If I had to pick like the best game ever made, but that's just me. That's just me. So let's get into this. Okay. So I'll read part of this, and part of this will be done by voice to text. Sorry, text to speech. And I'm gonna have to look into getting a new a text to speech program after this, because Kurzweil I've had for like, God, almost 20 years now, and it's getting kind of long in the tooth. So try to get something with a bit more sufficient. I've looked for other stuff before, but it's always been worse than this. However, now that like everything is AI based, maybe this is good. So the dedication, we're already off to a good start. This book is dedicated to Shigeru Miyamoto for saving my life more times than he knows. That's a bad sign of the gate. As we'll know from this, Shigeru Miyamoto is basically Movie Bob's god. Christopher and Catherine Chipman for always being there. Peter and Patricia Chipman for everything. I don't know who they are. And in loving memory of Evangeline Chipman for setting an example. So Shigeru Miyamoto is first. Shigeru Miyamoto is more important to his life than his parents are. Super Mario brick by brick first printing. All right. All right. Now let's get this. Okay, so we have the menu instead of a table of contents. By the way, speaking of Nintendo, they released the Castlevania Dominus pack, which is the three 3DS games on I think Steam, but I know on Switch. So that is Order of Ecclesia, Portrait of Ruin, and Dawn of Sorrow. Are all on available on Switch now. So I've been playing them, and they're amazing. Yeah, it's available on Steam. It's only like $33 Canadian, which is a bargain. If I ever say. So okay. So we have My Life in the Mushroom Kingdom. Okay, so we'll start off. Oh, oops, let me unmute that. There was some stuff.
Why write a book about Super Mario Brothers? 3. I'm going to assume somebody is asking that question. I am, and I'm the one writing the damn thing. A book more generally about
Get it? It's self-referential.
About Mario, the character, would seem to make more sense. He's an icon, the icon of the video game industry and of the medium itself. A character as entrenched in the minds of generations X and beyond as Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny. Video games were the rock and roll of my generation, an art form that came into being and grew in tandem with our own lives, embraced by us to the confusion and exasperation of our parents.
Let me know if the sound quality is okay. Like I said, I'll gradually phase this out. If it's too fast, if it's too slow, let me know. I think another good aspect of this will be to see how well this stuff has aged. Because once again, this was 11 years ago, so this was back in the day.
Parents. And though he wasn't the first icon of the form, Mario was figured at the forefront, our Elvis or, if you prefer, our Beatles. Which probably makes Pac-Man Chuck Berry in this analogy. In any case, if this were to be a book of history or of pop iconography, surely it would be more comprehensive and sensible to cover the full breadth of Mario's career. At the time of this writing, Mario has appeared in nearly 190 individual games covering almost every conceivable gaming genre, 2 feature films, 1 live action, 1
Now 3 feature films.
Live action, 1 animated and released only in Japan, 4 animated series, multiple comic books, and in nearly every form of licensed merchandising imaginable. The story of the character's eminently humble beginnings, of his iconoclastic creator Shigeru Miyamoto, of his endurance through a changing video game landscape and sweeping cultural shifts. Would these not be more logical things to build a book around? And even if one did wish to focus on only the games, why limit the scope to only 1 out of the 190? Especially when there are other games in the series of greater historical significance? SMB3 isn't Mario's first appearance, that would be Donkey.
Okay, now I just want you guys to keep in mind this entire like first 2 or 3 pages of the book is him talking about how he's not going to go into the full history of Mario, and then he proceeds to go into the full history of Mario. Also, the stuff about his own life is, if it was like a satire or it was a joke, like it was something I would write, like as in like a Death to Normies Party character or something would be funny, but I'm pretty sure this is mostly serious.
Donkey Kong, or the game that made him a household name by reviving the previously dead home gaming industry. That's the original Super Mario Bros. Or the birthplace of functional, open-world 3D platforming, Super Mario 64, or any of the franchise's myriad other big impact moments. It's merely the 3rd game in the Nintendo Entertainment System era of the franchise. Where's the import? Where's the 9 Super Mario Bros. Story? What's the big deal? Assuming I was able to gather myself after receiving that withering barrage of queries all at once, I might offer that this book isn't precisely a book of history, though it will certainly contain its fair share, but rather a book primarily of video game criticism, which of course only begs more questions. Why start with Super Mario Bros. 3, then? It's not exactly crying out for attention. It's one of the best-selling games in the series, and of all time, already enshrined as an accepted, unassailable classic. Do you intend to challenge that status? Reveal the game as overrated, perhaps? No? Then, again, why? New Super Mario Bros. Wii is more recent. Super Mario Sunshine is the most intriguingly flawed of the series. Super Mario Bros. And Donkey Kong are more historically significant. Super Mario Bros. 2 inches has the more interesting backstory. What, if anything, are you looking to tell us here? Why should we be reading this, when there are so many tomes of self-help, political fire-breathing and 12-volume epics of glimmering vampire bow huntresses attending wizard school? Just a bookshelf, or a swipe across the touchpad, as it were, a way, to be honest.
Oh, that's some great pop culture humor there.
Be honest, even I didn't start out with the intent to write a book about Super Mario Bros. 3. The format of this project took shape before the subject came into focus for me. You see, at least to my knowledge, at the time of this writing there isn't another book exactly like this one.
See, that's always a good sign. You start off and you go, well, I didn't really have any intention when I was doing this. It just kind of happened. I just started writing and then the thought came to me.
Video game criticism has existed as long as the medium itself, said medium having come into being in the era of specialty publications, read, lifestyle magazines, and reached adolescence in the age of the internet. Times where it became the norm that everything was to be reviewed, critiqued, and consumer reported upon. But the form has always had an erratic evolution. The first game reviewers found themselves in the unique position of having to be both art critics, what feeling or sensation does this game elicit? And product testers, does this device work? The rapidly expanding technology of the medium and scope of the consumer base created fissures and divisions as different groups of gamers demanded different approaches from critics, aesthetic critique, technical details. Does it have a good story? Forget the story, how does it play? Give me detailed analysis. Give me a numbered score. The internet age turned game criticism into one of digital journalism's fastest growing fields with even more diversity, detailed write-ups and cultural...
It's really ironic that he talks about video game journalism like a year before Gamergate.
Cultural commentary from websites like The Escapist, Polygon, Destructoid.
Now, I said this in my original view, but I hate The Escapist. I've always hated The Escapist. They mentioned Yahtzee. I remember back in high school, people loved Yahtzee, and they showed me a video of his, and his accent just triggered me really hard, and I just hate all of his reviews. Destructoid was like, I remember that being like the first attempt to have like a professional journalistic video game review site.
Video reviews, often, but not always, comedic in nature, became the rage with the dawn of high-speed streaming, making unlikely superstars of folks like Ben Yahtzee, 10, Bob Chipman, Crawshaw of Zero Punctuation and James Rolfe aka the Angry Video Game Nerd. James's focus on older and more obscure titles was part of a growing interest in giving serious critical attention in hindsight to classic or retro games. Today, sites ranging from professional outlets to amateur free-for-alls like YouTube and Blip are packed to the gills with an ever-growing
Anyone remember Blip? I forget if that was the site that DSP single-handedly destroyed, but YouTube is still around.
Supply of not only game criticism but walkthroughs, strategies and long-form chronicles called Let's Plays. Name any game that has ever existed, no matter how obscure, and chances are
DSP has a full playthrough of it up.
You can find multiple reviews, videos and full-length playthroughs of it, and yet, amid all that, I felt like there was something missing. An empty niche. Maybe not a large niche, but a niche all the same. In my primary career I'm a film critic, so I get to see how criticism differs in the two mediums. And while I won't let this turn into some missive about what game journalism can learn from film, I'm inclined
It's so funny given like what movie Bob would go on to be involved in that he's talking about video game journalism so much.
inclined to note that the one type of critical attention gaming appears to be most, though not wholly, deficient of is analysis, in particular deep analysis. Specifically, in film writing there is such a thing as the shot-by-shot analysis, which is exactly what it sounds like: a book, or, more often, academic paper or presentation, that pores over a single film piece by piece, scene by scene, detail by detail. The lines, the compositions, the shots, the score, and the actors, directors, writers, and production history that informed it all. Not just an aesthetic criticism or a history or a production report, but a fusion of all three and more, the complete picture of a film. Why didn't this exist for video games? My first thought, upon not finding much that lined up with what I was now looking for, especially not available to consumers outside the industry or academia, was that it may have been tried and found impossible. But that didn't make any sense.
Only movie Bob could do a video game review like this in the form of a book. And I'm gonna warn you guys. I remember the first time I read this, I complained that it took too long for him to get to the actual brick by brick. But the brick by brick is awful because there's no pictures in this book. And I don't really know how you're supposed to do a brick by brick like analysis of a visual medium with no pictures. It's just kind of it's a strange idea.
Sense. Games are tangible things, at least as much as digitized information can be. Most of them have beginnings and endings, or at least a point where nothing else can be done within them. Whole books, called strategy guides, had been written with the purpose of guiding one through a game step by step. So why not go the extra mile and gives a reader the background or an aesthetic observation about whatever level or boss you're helping them to conquer?
So, anybody remember guidebooks? Guidebooks were awesome. It was the only way I got through a couple games. It was how I got through Majora's Mask and got all the masks. It was how I got through Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons and Wind Waker. Actually, I tended to get a guidebook for every Zelda game just because there's like just so many things you can miss. It's not necessarily that the games are that hard. It's just I didn't want to miss anything. Now, I kind of am going to give Movie Bob a little bit of credit. This is actually a problem I have with a lot of Let's Plays, is they don't really go that deep. And I'm guilty of this too when I do them. But a lot of the time it's just commenting on what's happening on stream. It's not talking about history. It's not talking about nobody's talking about genre or relating it to something else. This is actually an issue that I have with DSP and why I never got into any of his Let's Plays. DSP is just not a very well educated person. So he's not able to like do like talk about how this relates to history or to movies or to other video games or to genre or to philosophy or to religion or to politics or anything. It's just really basic reactionary commentary. And that was the reason I started kind of doing some of the stuff I started doing, like character profiles, reactionary reviews, sci-fi pulsi, and stuff like that. Just because I felt like I got tired of a lot of people who would just read the Wikipedia article, which I'm guilty of too, but it's so many videos where people do lore is literally just them reading things from the actual game and there's no speculation. So he's kind of right on this, but I don't think Movie Bob's the guy to do it.
Whole books, called strategy guides, had been written with the purpose of guiding one through a game step by step. So why not go the extra mile and gives a reader the background or an aesthetic observation about whatever level or boss you're helping them to conquer? And, if I couldn't find such a book, why not write it myself? The idea began to take shape. Pick a game. Play through it from beginning to end. Catalog everything you did, even the places where you did something wrong or had to start over. Describe, in detail, not just the function but the form. The whys and hows and who's behind what was. 11. Super Mario Bros. Happening in the game. For good measure, include what was going on for you during the playing. Player input is key to the experience, after all, so it's only fair to analyze the background of the player along with the background of the product. Yes, that might work, but which game? It would have to be an older game, for one. Not so much out of
You know, just off the top of my head, you could probably write a book about Alpha Centauri. I think that would probably like not be that hard even. About the philosophy and politics stuff of Alpha Centauri. You could also probably write a book about like Ocarina of Time, but I'm just talking about my favorite games.
out of nostalgia or sentiment, but because an older game would have its stature already secure. Preferably it should be a popular game, one that a lot of people would have played or at least know of. A work that has affected the culture in a big, visible way simply offers more to write about.
Sorry for digressing again, but kind of like how Escaflowne was kind of one of the first times I started to get interested into like philosophy and theology and kind of the fundamentals of reality. Alpha Centauri is the game that really got me interested in politics and in philosophy and in a lot of things like that. It really showed me that like video games can be art, and not just video games, but that media in general can teach you a lot about the world. And it is a unique form that could be used to uplift.
About. It should have a certain degree of variety, if for no other reason than to keep me consistently engaged so that boredom doesn't inappropriately color the analysis. Even though I wouldn't be primarily playing for fun, I'd have to endeavor to maintain the sense of enjoyment that regular gameplay is supposed to engender. Finally, I felt like it should be a game I was already intimately familiar with. A game I could not just approach, but return to in the writing. Aside from, likely, making the project that much less difficult, it would be appropriate to the intended tone. Not just some dry, academic deconstruction but an involved, emotive journey. I should be a game I loved, and, thus,
Oh, is that a spelling error there? Well, my book had a fuck ton of spelling errors, so I'm not going to complain. But
there could be no other choice. 12. Part I, A Brief History of Mario.
I thought he was saying he wasn't going to do a history of Mario. He said that on literally the first page. Like we're like 3 pages in, we're like 10 pages into this book, and already he's like wrong about it.
By now, the legend of Mario's creation is old hat to fans, but those who didn't grow up marinating in the game culture still would likely be surprised at the utilitarian simplicity of his origins. Today we're used to receiving our cultural icons only after a lengthy process of focus grouping and demographic charting.
By the way, if you want like a book that does what this does, but like better in every way, I'd recommend Super Mario: How Nintendo Conquered America, which is the whole story behind Nintendo, Donkey Kong and stuff like this. Actually, this came out a year previously, so I would not be surprised if Movie Bob didn't copy large portions of that for this background, but that book is way better than this.
Demographic charting, particularly video game personalities, who must often bear the weight of cross-cultural expectations. Japanese games frequently see their androgynous heroes transformed into hyper-masculine forms to better appeal to Western taste, and navigate the minefields of socio-political symbology. Just what is the proper length of a skirt between sexually empowered and pandering male fantasy? Mario, on the other hand, came about the old-fashioned way. A character was needed, and one was made in the best form available from the tools available. And rather than a marketing team or a team of demographic analysts, Mario sprang from the mind of one man, Shigeru Miyamoto. Today, Miyamoto is a living legend, the starry-eyed iconoclast of the video game industry, spoken of by other designers less like a contemporary and more like a mysterious sorcerer who deigns to walk among mortals. But, once upon a time, He was just one among hundreds of men and women toiling in the nascent days of the game industry. Doubtlessly too hard at work to even consider that their every tiny success.
So somebody had mentioned this, and I had referenced this the first time I read this book. Somebody claimed that a lot of this seemed like Movie Bob just took a thesaurus and randomly inserted words he didn't really know the meaning of in various parts of the book to try to make himself seem a lot smarter than he actually is. Nascent is definitely an instance of that. I really doubt Movie Bob knows what nascent means.
Success and failure might be laying the foundations of an entirely new medium. A new form of art. Miyamoto's backstory is a mix of iconic and humble, almost perfect enough to render him as a character in one of his games, a precocious child with a great love of art, music and wilderness exploration who dreamed of growing up to be a manga, Japanese comic book, artist. Instead, he found himself working for Nintendo, a toy and playing card company that had moved into the video game business. With decidedly mixed results, so goes the story. Nintendo's most recent game, and Miyamoto's first role as part of a design team, Radarscope had failed to replicate its popularity in Japan when it was exported to US arcades. The head of the company's newly established American branch, the nephew of its CEO, was stuck with a surplus of unwanted machines, and the decision was made to rewrite the game's program into something new so that the unsold units could be reprogrammed and their cabinets repainted. The task of conversion fell to Miyamoto, an unconventional decision, given that he was primarily an artist and designer with little experience as a programmer, but one that would prove faithful. He was given very little to go. 14. Bob Chipman on, just the requirement that all of the programming be built from the
Once again, this is so similar to the same section in Super Mario How Nintendo Conquered America. I'm convinced he just copy pasted it and stole this portion of the book.
built from the existing parts of Radarscope and an early suggestion that Nintendo might be able to secure the license for Popeye the Sailor. When that fell through, he had to develop new characters and a scenario. In doing so, he was making history. For the first time, a video game's characters and story were being developed before the interface was. The early Popeye brainstorming had naturally called to mind the scenario of rescuing olive oil from the villain Bluto, and had fixed in Miyamoto's mind the idea that players would be enticed to keep playing by the goal of having to rescue the hero's girlfriend rather than simply trying to rack up more points. Simple and arch though it may have been, this would be the first time that a game had tried to engage players through narrative and emotion rather than.
Does he mean simple and archetypical? It's just I've never seen arch used in that sense before.
Rather than strictly through competition. Bluto was replaced by a gorilla, Donkey Kong, which in turn suggested the girl abducted by Ape finale of King Kong, which in turn suggested the gameplay of scaling a building in pursuit of said ape. But the game still needed a main character. An avatar for the player. It needed a hero, in keeping with his desire for the game to have characters as well defined as the hardware would allow. Miyamoto wanted his hero, whom he was still considering calling MR. Video to stand out within the game, to have recognizable human-like movements and a face, and while video game graphics of the day placed severe restrictions on such ambitions, a clever artist could find a way. And so, MR. Video got a big Italian-style mustache to give his face and nose definition in profile, and would wear overalls so that his arms would be more visible against his body. They'd call him Jumpman, at first. But he soon got a new nickname based on his apparent similarity to one Mario Segale, a colorful real estate mogul who was Nintendo of America's warehouse manager at the time. The finished game, Donkey Kong, was a smash hit. And Mario was born. Miyamoto would revisit the character soon after in two Kong sequels and Mario Brothers, a two-player co-op game reminiscent of Joust that introduced.
I just want to read a comment in the chat. Liberian Rebel says, I would read the Ocarina guidebook that my friend lent me even though I'd never seen nor played the game. I corrected that in my late teens. I loved that book. Yeah, I used to read strategy guides too.
Introduced Mario's brother Luigi and gave them a new backstory as New York City plumbers combating an infestation of crabs. bugs and turtles in a room full of pipes. Nintendo, fueled largely by the success of Miyamoto-developed games, branched out into the home video game market, which had collapsed in the US, but was thriving in Japan. And the ability of these Famicom games.
Interesting. If you read the Super Mario, the actual book that he stole from, they talk about the how I think Universal sued Nintendo over Donkey Kong. Now, firstly, like they can't do that because Donkey Kong is obviously a parody of King Kong. So even if they held the copyright to King Kong, they wouldn't be able to do it. But apparently, Universal didn't even have the copyright to King Kong, so it was even more relevant.
Games to be longer and more complex led Miyamoto to expand his newly iconic character in an unprecedented way. 15. Super Mario Bros.
The Golden Age.
The Golden Age. The title told the tale. Super Mario Bros. Was Mario Bros. Blown up to epic proportions. Instead of a single screen, the hop and bop gameplay would now be spread across an entire world that scrolled from left to right in the inaugural example of a genre that would come to dominate the golden age of video games, the side-scrolling platformer. Mario and Luigi wouldn't simply be crossing the screen, they'd be passing through a whole world, different skies, different terrains, underworlds, even swimming underwater. And this whole world would need still more characters and stories to populate it. Mario gained the ability to grow to giant, or supersize via magical mushrooms a la Alice in Wonderland, eventually leading the fairytale-inspired kingdom of castles and magic beanstalks that was being devised. Precisely how the Mario Brothers got there from NYC is the subject of much debate, to be named the Mushroom Kingdom. The hostage rescue scenario from Donkey Kong was revived with a new damsel in distress, Princess Peach, whom Western audiences would know as Princess Toadstool for more than a decade, and the turtle enemies of Mario Bros. Were expanded into an entire race of creatures called the Koopas, a reference to Kappas, mischievous turtle-like demons of Japanese mythology, ruled over by the wicked Bowser. Mario and Luigi would traverse 8 worlds split into 4 levels, each ending with the conquest of an occupied fortress and all but the last teasing the player with a rescued hostage who would
I'm just thinking, when I would say the golden age of video games is, I'd say like 1996 between the release of Super Mario 64, and I think around 2010. I'm trying to think of when I would say like when a good end date would be. Like maybe the release of Dragon Age 2 or Mass Effect 3. I kind of feel like Mass Effect 3 is like was the game where everything started to go bad.
inform you that the princess was in another castle. The success of Super Mario Bros. Was immediate and overwhelming. The kind of electrifying impact that only ever happens once or twice in the lifespan of a medium. In its native Japan, the game served as an eye-popping send-off for the original Famicom as Nintendo shifted focus to an upgraded disk system version of the device. But in the West, especially the US, the game was the trigger for something much bigger, a full-on resurrection. While home gaming on machines like the Famicom had been steadily popular in tech-loving.
So what you're saying is Nintendo was the video game Jesus.
Tech-loving Japan, game consoles had been dead in America since 1983 when quality control issues and a weary consumer base had caused the entire industry to collapse in on itself. The entire industry thought Nintendo was insane for trying to launch the Nintendo Entertainment System, a US version of the Famicom.
So something interesting. Somebody pointed this out to me. One of the things that's been the most inflation resistant is video game prices. Like I remember back in the '90s, video game prices you could get a like a Game Boy Advance game for like $30 or $40. Most new games for a very very long time, up to like even like 10 years ago, were $60. That was the standard price. If it was an expansion or something, it would be $40. It's only really now that the base price for a video game is $80. It had very little inflation over time compared to how much a lot of other things have gone up. Just kind of an interesting thought.
Famicom. There, But the naysayers were caught slack-jade as the NES became an instant earth-shaking Mageddon in 1985 and it was SMB. The game was sold packed in with early versions of the system. 16. Bob Chipman that propelled much of that momentum as Nintendo went on to become synonymous with the medium they'd brought back from the dead through most of the 80s and 90s. In Japan, Mario returned immediately in Super Mario Bros. 2 is essentially a more difficult, slightly tweaked remix of the first game, but it was judged both too difficult for neophyte American gamers and too visually outdated by the time it would be reaching US shores. It would ultimately be released there a decade later.
Once again, neophyte I don't think is used quite correctly there. I feel like he was once again just using a thesaurus.
Decade later as the lost levels. Instead, the decision was made to convert a then newer Miyamoto game, Doki Doki Panic, into America's SMB2 by redrawing its 4 main character sprites as Mario, Luigi, Toad, the first Mushroom Kingdom citizen like those rescued at the end of SMBL's first 7 worlds to be given a name of his own, and Princess Peach. The American SMB2 divides fans to this day. The radical shift in tone, style and gameplay was explained away in the plot as Mario having a strange dream, but was responsible for many of the series' now standard elements. Chief among them recasting Luigi as a slimmer, taller brother rather than a palette swap twin of his brother and adding enemy characters like Shy Guys and Bob Ohms to the Mario canon. It also, arguably, was responsible for further proving that gamers could love a franchise's character and or world enough to embrace a complete gameplay overhaul. Subsequent NES sequels like Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link and Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest would make similarly drastic formula changes from their predecessors.
So I remember one time when I with Nintendo Power, if you had purchased a GameCube and I think 2 games for it, you could send the codes in and they would send you the Zelda Collector's Edition. So the Zelda Collector's Edition was a GameCube game that had the first Zelda game, Adventures of Link, Ocarina of Time, and Majora's Mask. So yes, there is a version of Majora's Mask that you can play on GameCube, interestingly enough. And I remember playing Adventures of Link, and I didn't like it. I'm not good at video games, so I found it just too hard. Also, it was just really weird. It felt like some sort of a fever dream.
What can't be argued is that the game's release coincided with Mario's ultimate ascent to pop culture godhood, between the release of this American sequel and Super Mario Bros. 3, our main subject, Mario and his cohorts would appear in a deluge of successful TV series, spin-offs and licensed products. His face adorned posters, birthday cakes and Happy Meal toys. Children dressed up as him for Halloween and scrawled the titles of his games on letters to Santa. In 1989, the impending release of SMB3 was considered an event of such incredible magnitude that an entire feature film, The Wizard, was produced on the pretext that kids would catch mere moments of gameplay during its climax.
The interesting thing about The Wizard, so I remember back in high school, I can't remember if it was Destructoid or something awful or something, but they would have a watch together called Shitty Movie Night, and they did The Wizard once, and I actually left because like the first 10 minutes is like the main character walking down this the kid walking down the street. So I didn't see any Nintendo, I didn't see any video games. Um but yeah. So I just left, and then they're like, no, that's just what the game is like. So there's that. Tipware to where Soap said the GNC controller is not good for 2D games. I wish someone built a custom one for titles like Network Transition. Yeah, the Switch Pro controller is basically a 360 controller in all but name, which I maintain is the best controller of all time. Is either, well, I have an Xbox One controller now, but I maintain that the Xbox/Xbox One controller is the best controller ever made. And it's really good to play. It feels really good to play games on it. I remember that was kind of a unique thing they had when they introduced the 360 controller, is that it, because it was a Microsoft product, it came compatible with all Windows computers, and most games even back then had 360 controls, and it was just so much better than like the crappy like aftermarket ones you could get uh at stores or like computer stores or Best Buy or whatever, because it was like a real controller. And I had my 360 controller. I think I still have it. I it's like 20 years old at this point, and it still functions. It's the balls on the joysticks have gotten a little loose, and the main issue is that the rubber on the joysticks came off, so it kind of hurts my fingers to use. But it was just very good, and I think that really helped to revolutionize PC gaming. I know, like playing Game Boy Advance platformers on a 360 controller with emulation was just a completely different experience, and I enjoyed it a lot more.
Climax. The game itself would go on to be, for a long time, the biggest individually selling game ever. This would be the high point of Mario Mania. 17. Super Mario Bros. 3. Brick by Brick, Life in Wartime.
Now, I don't think that this was actually a joke. He's going to talk, and I shit you not, and call the console wars his private Vietnam that like traumatized him for life. So let's just go through this.
In 1990, Mario once again led Nintendo into a new age as the ambitious Super Mario World, Super Mario Bros. 4 inches in Japan, became the flagship title of Nintendo's 16-bit Super NES. And while the game was a major success, now remembered as a classic of the genre, and for introducing Yoshi the dinosaur, one of the series' most popular characters. This was the beginning of the end for MR. Miyamoto's plucky plumber as the unquestioned king of all video game heroes, though it wasn't fully apparent to all gamers, especially not in the US, where the NES ran the floor all but unchallenged for almost a decade. Neither Nintendo nor Mario were ever the only game in town. They had major competition in gaming-saturated Japan, and game-friendly home computers like the Spectrum and Commodore 64 went toe-to-toe with the NES in Europe. And while the NES dominated North American sales and Mario lorded over gaming's cultural image, they had a persistent challenger in the form of rival console purveyor Sega, whose
So I'm just gonna come out and say it. I personally don't like more Super Mario Bros. 3. I don't think it's a bad game or anything. I'm just not very good at platformers. I'm I'm bad at 2D platformers. I like ones that are like a like Metroidvania, particularly RPG ones, because I can level and get armor and upgrades and kind of get around how bad I am at them. But I just have never really been able to play, other than maybe Mario Brothers 2, and had any kind of fun doing it. I don't even really like like the 3D ones are good. I just don't really enjoy them. To be honest. Like I admit Galaxy was a good game. I've never played Mario 64. Galaxy was a good game. Sunshine was a good game. It's just not a genre I particularly enjoy.
whose master system had leaked out a serviceable existence as the brand XNES and whose genesis beat the SNES to the 16-bit punch by a few years, so did NEC's short-lived TurboGrafx 16, and carved out a niche as the system better able to offer more authentic translations of arcade hits. But it lacked a Mario of its own. In 1991 that changed. Sonic the Hedgehog, looking for all the world like an electric blue, punk rock cousin to Mickey Mouse, became Sega's new mascot and the first serious contender for Mario's crown in the character's lifetime. Whereas Mario ambled through his colorful worlds, Sonic was all about speed and visceral conquest, One beat a Mario level, but one survived a Sonic level. Kenny Sega made the contrast between the two characters, Sonic's edgy 90s flippancy versus Mario's old-fashioned fusion of fairy tale whimsy and working-class Americana into the driving force of an ambitious marketing blitz. Genesis was the hip console, Nintendo its uncool rival. In playgrounds, arcades and living rooms all over America, young consumers chose up sides.
I think the only two games that I platformers I really played on the N64 was Donkey Kong 64, which I raged at a lot because I as I think I've said in the past, I have uh manual dexterity issues. Like they're not horrible, but I have trouble with some fine motor skill stuff. So I find a lot of stuff to do with video games difficult. I like Donkey Kong 64. I just found it kind of hard. And then there's Crystal Shards, which is probably the best Kirby game. Every other Kirby game I've tried to play, I just have not enjoyed.
Sides. In those days it was unheard of for an average kid to own more than one console, turning friend against friend as both companies gleefully stoked the fires amid skyrocketing sales.
Brother against brother, like the American Civil War.
The console wars had begun when the smoke finally cleared over the great conflict between SNES and Genesis. Nintendo had more or less come out on top in terms of raw sales and corporate stability. Mario, certainly, had a spectacular 90s with 18. Bob Chipman, Yoshi's Island, Mario Kart, Super Mario RPG, a litany of cameos and side projects, and the two Super Mario Land titles on Nintendo's portable Game Boy handheld.
I'll say this, I like the non-platformer Mario games, like Super Mario 64, I think is one of the best games of all time. So is Super Mario, sorry, no, sorry, not, Paper Mario, 64 is one of the best games of all time. Uh, Paper Mario Thousand Year Door is also one of the best games of all time. It recently got re-released. There's a thousand. If you want, you can get Thousand Year Door on Switch. It's like an HD upgrade. I'd highly recommend it. The writing in Paper Mario and Paper Mario Thousand Year Door is some of the best. Some of the best gameplay, just great. I like those a lot. I like the Mario Party games back in the day. Mario Kart was okay, but once again, I just have very bad motor skills, so it kind of just. I wasn't horrific at it, but I didn't particularly enjoy it. I also just found it kind of boring. But actually, Mario plus Rabbids is actually really good. Mario plus Rabbids is really good. If you've ever played it, it's like a Mario version of XCOM.
Handheld, the latter of which would introduce the enigmatic evil doppelganger Wario to the series' mythos. But the war had taken its toll in the realm of public perception. Sega hadn't removed or supplanted their rival, but they'd successfully lodged the image of Nintendo and Mario as the face of all things old-fashioned, unhip and childish in the industry. Though Nintendo hadn't helped their case by maintaining a Puritan policy against extreme violent or sexual content in an era where more explicit titles like Mortal Kombat and Doom were the talk of the industry. Within the industry, Nintendo increasingly came to be viewed in much the same way the Walt Disney Company had been in the 1980s, a powerful but stodgy and unmoving relic standing in vain against the tides of history, and much of their corporate behavior as the 90s wore on only reinforced that notion. At the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, they made an infamous public spectacle out of unexpectedly breaking a CD-ROM console-making partnership with Sony. One day after Sony had debuted the proposed device at the same show, it was.
So I was thinking about this the other day because people complain a lot, and I'm one of them, that Nintendo doesn't do what their fans want. Like, they don't re-release things don't go on sale, they make just decisions like adding in 3D to the 3DS or touchpad, or just weird decisions, re-releasing the consoles in like a slightly better format and stuff like that. And I was like, how does so there's kind of a disdain from their fans, but it's not the same as like with woke video game developers who actively hate their fans. So I think what it is Nintendo, and this probably comes from being an old school Japanese company, is very paternalistic towards its fan base. It loves its fans, but it likes to think that it knows what's best for them, and what they want better than what they think they want. And a lot of the time it's true. So they just kind of do their own thing and they kind of ignore whatever the meta is. They kind of try to create the meta rather than just kind of go in line with the meta. And that works a lot of the time, but sometimes it leads to stuff like the Wii U, which is a mess. But I think that's kind of the difference between Nintendo in a lot of other companies. I don't think they listen to their fans like at all, but they like their fans.
Was here that the bigger value of Mario as an icon
Whereas like Disney doesn't listen to their fans and hates their fans.
was coming into focus. The only conceivable way any game company could afford to conduct itself in such a way was on the strength of its first-party software. And with Mario in particular, Nintendo was holding the ultimate trump card. But even he wasn't invincible. In 1993, Miyamoto's creation finally found a challenge he couldn't surmount: a live-action Super Mario Bros. Movie, made by an American film studio, was an unmitigated disaster upon its release. Hunted stories of a trouble-plagued production opening to tepid box office and horrible reviews. At the height of Mario's popularity,
Okay, in this household, the Mario Brothers 1993 movie is Kino. I don't want to hear anybody say anything else. The Mario Brothers movie is amazing. I like to think that they hired Serp to make that movie because it had like body horror, like weird alternate dimensions, like all kinds of just weird surreal shit. I like to think that Serp time traveled back in time and they had him direct the Mario movie.
popularity, it was an early sign that things were not as comfortable as they appeared. Hard times. In 1996, Mario would be the face of gaming's next evolution once again. Super Mario 64 turned free roaming, three-dimensional gameplay from a dream, or a gimmick, to reality as the flagship game of the Nintendo 64 console. But while the game, and others that would follow, is today remembered as an all-time classic, the waning days of the 20th century would be lean years for Mario and his makers. In 1990,
Like once again, he talks like when I'm in character and I'm talking about like gamers are oppressed, and gamers need to rise up and stuff like that. He says all that stuff, but he's like serious about it.
1994, Sony had become the first company to successfully enter the game console race from outside the gaming biz with the PlayStation, a powerful machine built from the remnants of their cancelled collaboration with 19. Super Mario Bros. 3. Brick by brick, Nintendo. It filled the void left by the slow-motion collapse of
Now, someone can tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the PlayStation is actually a 32-bit game system. It's just that it's CD based, so it kind of creates this weird contrast with N64, where I think the graphics are technically worse, but you could do stuff like full motion video and have more like voice acting than you could on Nintendo games.
collapse of Sega, who found themselves unable to replicate the Genesis success in subsequent consoles, and ultimately overtook Nintendo as the top console producer. With third-party developers flocking to Sony, Nintendo was relying on its homegrown creations, and the unexpected mega popularity of the Pokémon franchise, and Mario especially. It was in this period that Mario the icon began to more fully supplant the attendant-rich gameplay experience as the driving force behind sales and notoriety. Despite the universal acclaim for Super Mario 64, he wouldn't headline another full-fledged action-adventure title until Super Mario Sunshine for the GameCube, another less than financially successful Nintendo console carried mainly by first-party software. In 2002, the legacy of the traditional Super Mario titles did continue, but in the form of rare releases and ports for the
Like
various.
I remember when I went over to a friend's house and he had like a PlayStation 1. Um and I he was showing me Metal Gear Solid and I just was like, this is shit. These are like the worst graphics. The load times are awful. So I think that's another thing. So part of the reason why Nintendo uses cartridges is because cartridges don't have load times, or they have very minimal load times compared to CDs. Also, it's harder to copy them. And I like to say, if you've ever been to Markham in southern Ontario, there's a place called the Pacific Mall, or at least there was, that's really well. I mean, you can gather what it is from its title. And whenever I'd go there, there would just be these massive bins full of bootleg video games, mostly Xbox 360 and like PlayStation games because those are on CDs. I never saw any GameCube games there because it has like its unique proprietary format. So I think that's part of the reason why they insisted on using cartridges for so long, is to just make it harder to copy them, and I think that did help.
Various Game Boy iterations. Those faltering in consoles, Nintendo remained unfailingly dominant in the world of handheld gaming. Instead, Mario's console ubiquity took a new form as the standard bearer for the emerging, popular party game genre, while the N64, the first home console to come with 4 controller ports as a standard, also accelerating the party genre, and GameCube were gifted with only one full Mario game apiece. He was all over the rest of their bigger titles. The Mario Kart franchise was a smash hit on both systems, and video board game Mario Party was so popular, particularly with Generation NES kids now entering college, where the party game genre fully blossomed. It spawned 7 sequels across both consoles, but biggest of all were the 2 Super Smash Bros. Games, one on each system, wherein players could make Mario and the other Nintendo mainstays fight each other. If nothing else, it seemed that the Mario Brothers would endure. Even as the company and the consoles he'd always called home seemed to be slipping away from under him. The rebirth. By 2006, much of the games industry expected Nintendo to have fallen away like Sega and probably to have taken Mario with them. Neither the N64 nor the GameCube had lit up the world like the NES and SNES had. And while they and their mascot remained household names, the golden age of gaming they'd been part of was beginning to fade. One-time rival Sonic the Hedgehog was a shadow of his former self, and once familiar names like Mega Man and Simon Belmont were being supplanted by the likes of Kratos, 20, Bob Chipman and
So
Master Chief.
so my okay, once again, um in this household, the GameCube's a great console. I love my GameCube. I had my GameCube, and I eventually got a Wii, and I had a like a good computer. I would say though my favorite console of all time is probably the Game Boy Advance. It just has honestly an incredible library. There's so many good games for Game Boy Advance. You have the 3 Castlevania games on it: Circle of the Moon, Aria of Sorrow, and Harmony of Dissonance. You have 3 Mega Man Battle Network games. You have Tactics Ogre and Night of Lotus, Advanced Wars, uh, Pokemon Ruby, Fire Red, Leaf Green. There was just so many good games on Game Boy Advance.
And Master Chief. The true console war of this new age was between Sony's PlayStation line, about to enter its 3rd iteration, and Microsoft's Xbox, about to launch its new 360 version. Mario, as the face of Nintendo, had become a side player in the game that used to rule. That's what everyone thought, at least, when Nintendo and Shigeru Miyamoto, who had, in the intervening years, risen to a role of great prominence within the Nintendo corporate regime, announced that they'd be producing another console after the GameCube built around some new form of interactivity rather than a major power upgrade. Not much attention was paid. A Hail Mary pass from a one-time giant soon to fall, no need to get too excited. Until they saw it, the mystery console, first called the Nintendo Revolution but later renamed the Wii, was an
I was a Nintendo fanboy, so I used to say long live the revolution.
was an ambitious attempt to upend the entire gaming landscape, a platform aimed not exclusively at longtime Nintendo fans nor at the increasingly dominant 18-30-plus hardcore gamer audience but at families, ex-gamers and even non-gamers. Built around a new style of motion sensing controller. Traditional gamers and industry insiders balked, but consumers went mad for it all at once. Nintendo products were flying off the shelves. The Game Boy successor, the DS, was also a major seller, and the house Miyamoto built was the king of console sales once again. But where was Mario?
I forget, is the DS the best selling console of all time? I mean, it also, I guess, depends if you include the 3DS as the DS or in the new 3DS. I was not a big Wii fan. I hate motion controls in general. There was a number of good games. I wound up using my Wii mostly for GameCube games. Honestly.
There was a feeling of distinct nostalgia watching consumers once again line up in rush stores for the new Nintendo, but the Wii's initial public presence was anything but nostalgic. The new system's design and aesthetic eschewed the candy-colored Nintendo of the past for a sleek white and blue Zen effect clearly modeled on Steve Jobs' Apple products. The Wii's flagship game was Wii Sports, a showcase for motion control starring self-made avatars of the player called Mize. And while one of the most enticing early features of the system was the Virtual Console, a service for downloading classic games, the traditional Nintendo menagerie seemed to have been pushed gently to the background. But, as it turned out, it was just a matter of waiting. Super Mario Galaxy, a sci-fi-infused return to the 3D platforming action of Mario 64 and Sunshine, marked a big return for the character on the Wii, and was successful enough to spawn the
Remember he said on like the third page or the first page, this is not going to be a complete history of Mario and we're not going to be discussing all the games he's been in. He's been doing a pretty good job covering them all.
spawned the Mario series' first direct sequel since the original Japanese SMB2. An ambitious follow-up to the Smash Bros. Series also made a major impact, and in that game and a much-hyped separate title built around the Olympics found Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog appearing in the same games for the first time. All well and good, but the real return to prominence for Mario was actually sneaking up. 21. Super Mario Bros. 3. Brick by brick on people. Around the same time that the impending launch of the Wii was getting all the attention, Nintendo released New Super Mario Bros. To the DS. It was full-scale throwback to the golden age Mario games, a side-scroller in the vein of SMB1 with power-up suits and a map system reminiscent of SMB3. Such a thing was bound to be popular with now-grown generation NES gamers, many of whom had adopted the DS as a source of retro-style gaming of the modern era, but its sales exceeded expectations and the reception clearly indicated that.
Okay, I looked it up. So the PlayStation 2 sold over 155 million consoles. The Nintendo DS sold approximately 154 million consoles. So that's so close. I feel like that is basically the same. I kind of feel once you get that high number and that close, it's about the same amount. The 3DS sold 76 million consoles. So it depends how you want to count things. If you want to count the DS and 3DS as one console or not.
That it wasn't just old fans who loved old Mario. 2 years later, Nintendo announced they would continue the series. On the Wii, New Super Mario Bros. We would best be described as SMB3 but with 4 players on screen at the same time. Like its predecessor, everything about it was classic. The princess? Kidnapped. The culprit? Bowser. Standing in your way? The Koopalings, Bowser's kids, largely absent from the series for the last several installments. That the response to the game was positive was practically a given, but the magnitude of its popularity shocked the industry. It was immediately one of the most popular Wii games to hit the market, and as of 2012 has sold over 26 million copies, easily placing it among the best-selling games of all time. It was almost poetic, The game that firmly re-established Mario as an icon of equal relevance and presence to more modern figures was a throwback to the obsolete genre that got him here in the first place. The
No,
once
Indro, we're gonna endure this. We're gonna go through this whole fucking book. Don't worry, it's gonna get into the autobiography part, and we're gonna learn that movie Bob, to the surprise of no one, was a constant disappointment to his parents.
the once and future king. Today, improbably, Mario has become even more ubiquitous than ever. While gamers remain bitterly divided over the relative worth and import of the Wii, the console is, in late 2012, approaching the end of its lifespan. It was the most visible, talked about and biggest selling machine of its generation. And the sheer magnitude of its penetration has enhanced the visibility of everything associated with it. Miyamoto, once known only to gamers, is now a techno-celebrity honored multiple times on Time magazine's most influential people list. And his creations have fared even better. The mega success of NSMB Wii was followed by Super Mario 3D Land and New Super Mario Bros. 2 inches on the 3DS, both of which were similarly runaway hits, and, incidentally, both involved the return of much-loved elements from SMB3. Mario and his friends, now with 2 generations, and counting, of devoted fans, are again
Indro, this book is movie Bob's magnum opus. It's his history of video games. It's his autobiography. It's a brick by brick, frame by frame review of Mario 3. This book is all things to all men.
fans, are again immortalized in every form from clothing to snack foods to toys. A mom or dad can walk to a store. 22. Bob Chipman sporting a nostalgic t-shirt referencing a Mario game they grew up with and purchase a Mario doll for a child who is growing up with him now. As of this writing, Nintendo is preparing to launch the Wii U, a successor console to the original Wii. One of the prime games already slated to be among its premier launch titles? New Super Mario Bros. U. The console that will officially kick off the next generation of home gaming will have as its first big showpiece a Mario game executed in the classic Mario style. After all these years, he still looms that large. Impressive, considering how humbly he began. Incredible, considering how humbly I came to meet him. 23.
Okay, we're gonna get to the autobiography. I'm just gonna quickly run to the bathroom, and then we will do this. Okay, here we go. So, part 2, Mario and Me, My Life in the Mushroom Kingdom. It kind of reminds you of Disaster Artist, My Life in the Room, doesn't it? Let's go on.
The time before.
Okay, guys, this is when I'll probably have to clip this part. This is when it gets fucking amazing if you've endured this long.
Before, Mario and I were born the same year, 1981. I'm about 5 months older, and as such I don't really remember a world without him. Looking back as best as I'm able, I know I must have been aware of his existence as long as I was aware of anything else, but I'll confess that I was not an immediate devotee.
Okay, just how crazy this is. Once again, this doesn't sound like a parody. This doesn't sound like like satire. He's going, the first thing I was aware of after I was born, I saw a Mario doll. I saw like the doctor who was supposed to be um attending to me was playing Mario Bros over in a corner, and Super Mario Bros was the first thing that I ever saw. And we're the same age. I am Mario. I am Mario.
Devotee, arcade games, both in full arcades and as individual machines at restaurants or convenience stores, were fairly common then, so I'd certainly seen the Donkey Kong machine about. And I distinctly remember Mr. Rogers once demonstrating how arcade cabinets worked via that same machine. I remember seeing the DK cartoon show, featuring Mario, once or twice, though it wasn't part of my regular TV viewing. He-Man was more my thing.
Did anybody ever watch the like 3D CG Donkey Kong cartoon show? Yeah, it was awesome.
At the time. In fact, apart from those aforementioned ventures to arcades, most often the one at good old Salem Willows Park, video games were just not much of a presence in my early life. Home gaming, a big fad in the late 70s and early 80s, was well into its famous crash when I was becoming conscious of the world around me. The only thing I really knew of it was that it was some kind of grown-up toy, since the only time I ever saw a console was when my uncle and aunt would come over to hang out, after I was supposed to be in bed, and he and my father would play through a game or two of baseball on Dad's Atari 2600, a machine that, with its black and wood panel design, looked like all the other grown-up toys, the stereo, the station wagon, that I wasn't supposed to play with. Even the marketing blitz that accompanied the launch of the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985 didn't really intrigue me. Advertisers hadn't really figured out how to translate the fun.
Dude, you were 4 years old at the time. Why would you, like, I don't remember shit from when I was 4. I guess because it has to do with Mario, like he remembers all this stuff. I don't know. Maybe other people remember a lot more from when they were like 4 years old. I really don't. Um Like this whole thing is insane. This dude has Arrested Development.
Fun of game playing through commercials yet, and early NES ads focused on the system's more explicitly toy-like features, ROB, a toy robot that ostensibly served as a second player in some games but in reality was Nintendo's bid to make toy stores feel more at ease stocking their product, and the Zapper light gun. Well, I already had toy robots. Optimus Prime was much cooler than ROB, and I'd seen other toys purporting to interface with TVs that didn't look like that much fun to me. 26. Bob Chipman, the first encounter, but I remember...
Yeah, but Rob was no match for Robbie the Robot, if anyone knows that reference.
Remember exactly where I was when I first connected with the NES, because it was also the moment I first discovered Mario. I was with...
Discovered Mario. I discovered my spirit animal.
Was with my mother, paying a visit to the home of a new friend. We'd met in kindergarten, and my mother wanted to meet his before we arranged any play dates. I was the firstborn, so research like this went into pretty much every decision. While
Who talks like that? It's like some like early like alt-right. I was the firstborn. I was the heir to the family name. My parents wanted to preserve their genetic legacy.
Decision. While our mothers chatted, my friend had something he wanted to show me in the kitchen, his NES, currently sitting on the kitchen table hooked up to a small TV set. And there, on the screen, was Super Mario Bros. I was captivated immediately. I had never seen a video game, at home or otherwise, look like this. Instead of the usual black background populated by conflicting neon shapes, here was a bright blue sky with puffy white clouds over rich brown earth and green bushes. The creatures were identifiable, with eyes and feet and movement. The bricks looked like bricks. The castles looked like castles. And there was Mario chubby, clad in unassuming overalls and his preposterous mustache, looking for all the world like no hero of anything else that I'd ever seen. I watched him play, gladly, for what seemed like forever. It was probably more like 20 minutes, before I was offered a turn myself. I was terrible at it, dying repeatedly, but I was also transfixed.
For me, like the first game that really filled me with a total sense of wonder was probably Ocarina of Time. Also Halo 1. When I first played Halo 1 on the OG Xbox, I thought it was the most amazing thing that had ever been made by a human.
Transfixed. This miraculous machine, to my eyes, projected a cartoon that you could control onto a TV. And there were more of them than this. Ones that looked, according to my friend, even cooler. With soldiers and bombs and cars and all manner of things. And maybe even more with this Mario person whose image now refused to leave my mind. I was mesmerized. I was hooked. I was sold. My parents, on the other hand, would take further convincing.
Okay, like once again, this doesn't feel to me like he's exaggerating this for comedic purposes.
Convincing. My brother and I were not exactly hurting for playthings. A game console was quite an investment, and I can only assume they remembered that the last time a toy like this had become a big deal it hadn't lasted for very long. In addition, well, I was not the easiest child in the world to be raising, at the time. I was bad at
Okay, this we're getting into the point where movie Bob is going to talk about how he was a massive disappointment who ruined his parents' lives, and not so much words. Let's just go back.
In addition, well, I was not the easiest child in the world to be raising, at the time. I was bad at school, mainly, I acted out in class, sassed my teachers, zoned out into daydreams, and turned in a lot of poor work. I wasn't good at much of anything school-related other than drawing and creative writing. So it wasn't as though I was in for some kind of attaboy reward that an NES would fill.
And 30 years later, nothing has changed.
Instead, they broke out the old Atari 2600 and said it could be mine. 27. Super Mario Bros. 3. Brick by brick. Now thanks to the NES, the market had come back to life and they were making games for the system again. It was no substitute for an NES, and especially not for Mario. But it was something, and looking back, starting with such an earlier form of gaming helped refine my skills and probably gave me a lot more respect for the evolution of the medium overall.
That's so fucking pretentious. I was trained on the Atari 2600. I was forged by Atari 2600. You merely adopted Atari 2600.
Overall. Meanwhile, I was filling page after page of drawing paper with painstaking recreations of the vivid images I'd seen on my friend's kitchen TV. That wide open world, those fearsome enemies, that iconic hero, and this is supposed to be the part where I tell you how I got my NES. The circumstances. The reasons. How I felt, except I don't remember. That sounds ridiculous, even to me, given the subject of this book and the detail with which I recall everything else. Granted, I was 5, but still. Nobody is more surprised that I don't remember exactly when I got it. Christmas? Birthday? Good report card. Unlikely.
Like, look, we've had 30 pages of build up. He's gonna get the NES. This is gonna be the moment that changes Movie Bob's life. And he didn't eat, like, he's just like, I don't know. I don't know when I got the NES. I don't know when I got, and this is just, it's just such a fucking disappointment, Bob.
Unlikely. Even my family didn't recall the exact details. One day I didn't have one, the next day I did.
I think he stole it. That's going to be my guess, is that he stole his NES, and we're going to go forward on that basis.
Did. I feel strangely bad that I don't remember this. It makes me feel ungrateful, like something this important should have stuck in my head, permanently, by sheer force of gratitude. But, maybe that's the point. Maybe the act of finally procuring my own direct access to Super Mario Bros. Was so monumental to my young mind it rendered everything else occurring immediately around it non-existent in my mind. What I do remember is that my young life now had a clear dividing line, pre- and post-NES.
Wow. So he was so excited to get an NES that he had a psychotic episode, and it, like, an entire period of his life is forgotten.
The New World. In any case, At last, I had it. My very own Nintendo and my very own copy of Super Mario Bros., both of which I could play whenever I wanted for however long I wanted, providing I kept my grades up, kept my behavior decent, and promised to share with my brother, of course. Soon enough there were games other than Mario, Duck Hunt, Balloon Fight, Ice Climber, The Legend of Zelda, Contra, the same sampler of classics a lot of Generation NES remembers, but SMB was the one I kept coming back to helpfully. The game was actually extremely hard to complete. I never actually beat Bowser on my own without help until years later, to be honest. My brother and I would take turns playing through, trying to get just a little bit further. Sometimes Dad would help out for the longest time. He was the only one in the family who could do the famous one-up trick in level 3-1. The NES and Mario were the first toy that I ever loved enough to. 28. Bob Chipman invest into the broader culture around it. I played the game constantly, but I also
The broader culture around it.
I also devoured any shred of information about games that I could get my hands on. I'd tear through books and magazines about games when I found them at the store. I'd pump my NES-owning friends for information on what was new and awesome. I read every scrap of info about Mario I could find, especially. It was during this research that I came to know that Mario was a plumber, for example, which made my connection to him that much stronger, since that was also the profession of my grandfather, whom I adored. On the schoolyard,
His grandfather, who was a respectable and productive member of society, unlike you. The connection to, like, is a connection to Mario.
schoolyard, I learned from friends of a magazine, Nintendo Power, devoted only to NES games. That in and of itself was enough to interest me, but the game being advertised on the cover of its 1988 inaugural issue was a dream come to life. Super Mario 2? I just had to get a subscription. I did, as a Christmas gift. The first issue now hangs in a frame on my wall, and I definitely had to have that game.
Jeez, I wish I hadn't, like, recycled most of my Nintendo Powers. Oh. Some of them might be worth something now, or I could just go through them and, like, I don't know. I'd like to reread a lot of them. Nintendo Power was awesome. I love Nintendo Power.
Game. Like most people, I didn't find out until I was older that what Western gamers got an SMB2 was actually Doki Doki Panic, a different Japanese game from Mario's creator that had been reprogrammed to feature Mario and his friends as the playable characters. But the fact that Mario's second game was so remarkably different from the first, a whole new playstyle, new enemies, a new main bad guy named Ward, actually made me even more invested in the character and his world, now Worlds, by virtue of how big it suddenly seemed. Video game sequels, at the time, were typically expansions or refinements of their predecessor. This had, of course, been the case with the real SMB2 in Japan, but here was a part 2 that suggested, simply by existing, that Mario was more than just the graphics and gameplay that had come first. He may not have been an especially well-developed character in the games themselves, but in my mind he was bigger and more richly drawn than any other hero in games by virtue of this newly revealed malleability. If Mario could fight evil in the Mushroom Kingdom and Subkin, SMB2 is said to take place in a world of dreams, there was no limit to what he could do. In between, and sometimes during, sessions of gaming, my imagination would be alive with what Mario and company might be saying or doing beyond the borders of the story I was playing through. Soon enough, I wouldn't have to wonder. 29. Super Mario Bros. 3. Brick by brick, beyond borders. Looking back at it objectively, the Super Mario Bros. Super Show was one of the most ridiculous things I ever devoted time to watching as a kid. An hour-long eyesore of self-conscious kids separated from earlier, equally Baroque kiddie program.
I feel like Baroque is an instance of him using a thesaurus.
Programming only in that its pool of visual references were culled from Nintendo ephemera instead of circus clowns or animal puppets. One half of the thing was a blatant lift of Pee-wee's Playhouse, with pro wrestler Captain Lou Albano and character actor Danny Wells as a live-action Mario and Luigi having slapstick adventures in a basement plumbing office also populated by wacky props and creatures where every frantic physical comedy gag was punctuated by a video game sound effect rather than the traditional boink. These scenes framed the show's main event, episodic animated adventures of Mario and company as they battled King Koopa, a fusion of Bowser and SMB2's Ward, as Nintendo hadn't informed the animators which villain would be the ongoing baddie in the games, through comic adventures and the occasional broad movie parody. Except on Fridays, where the cartoon segments switched over to a Moonlighting-esque adaptation of The Legend of Zelda. Of course, I loved every minute of it. However ubiquitous Mario and games in general were to my generation were children, and children don't run the culture. So when some sliver of the culture featured one of your game heroes as a show, movie, comic, etc., you almost had to snap it up, not knowing where the next fix was going to come from. Neither the Super Show nor the various comics and books pushed out as tie-ins were high art, but it was what we had, and they helped further solidify the idea of Mario as a character with life beyond the games. This was also the first point where you started to see video games stretch beyond their separate sections at toy stores and elsewhere. There wasn't the deluge of Mario merchandise there is today, but you started to see them around, especially at smaller shops that imported bulk sundries from Japan where these things were more heavily merchandised. I found a small, sturdy figurine of Mario holding up one of the
Okay, this is fucking amazing what we're about to get.
vegetables from SMB2 in a tiny outlet while vacationing in New Hampshire, and wound up carrying him in my pocket the rest of the way through grade school as a good luck totem, which I very much needed.
It became his religion. He carried around the little Mario the way some people carry around crucifixes, the way Sikhs carry around daggers, the way Muslims carry whatever it is Muslims carry around with them. It's like in this random place in New Hampshire, like run by some like shady old sorcerer who was actually like the villain of the movie Bob movie, who was trying to get him the cursed object, or I don't know, some nonsense like that.
I should stress, lest I come off as even more obsessive about these things, 30, Bob Chipman, than I actually am, that I did have other interests. I'd become a voracious reader, thanks in no small part to my Nintendo Power subscription, and a lover of science and technology, which in turn had led me to an interest in special effects, which in turn led me to a greater fascination with films and filmmaking. And I certainly had other venues of entertainment. Like many others our age, my brother and I were consumed by the world of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for much of the late 1980s. What Nintendo and
I really like the reboot of TMNT. I think the one from like the 2000s, I really enjoyed that one.
And Mario was my happy place, my constant. While I won't claim that I had anything close to an unhappy childhood, particularly compared to many of my friends, I wasn't having an easy time of pre-adolescence. I was, quite emphatically, a nerd in every sense of the word, save for academic excellence.
What a self-felt. What a gigantic self-felt. I was a nerd who also sucked at school, so basically he was just a loser in all regards of his life.
Excellence. I had too much of a problem with authority to be any good at schoolwork, but
I was too much of a problem with authority, yep.
Schoolwork, but was still too weird and bookish to be accepted by most of my peers. Instead of dealing with this in some kind of mature fashion, I made one bad decision after another, including the classic asshole move of trying to endear myself to the cool kids by trying to join the name-calling and belittling of the other uncool kids. A part of me will probably hate myself for that until my dying day.
So movie Bob's self-reflection, and that's why I view this as like a desperate cry for help. I think this also like could be viewed in a certain context as a suicide note. But so he was unintelligent, socially awkward, and a bully, who was bad at school. So basically, he had no redeeming characteristics whatsoever.
I should probably add that I was attending a Catholic school at the time, so all my issues came packaged alongside an inseparable religious guilt to boot and the teachers.
Well, I mean, he should have guilt, shouldn't he? I mean, he's a piece of shit. Like, he was a bully who was like disrespectful to his teachers and didn't put any effort into his schoolwork. So yeah, he should have felt bad. Catholic school W?
Teachers, free from the rigors of dealing with kids with serious problems like their public school counterparts, had plenty of time to devote to fixing me.
Serious problems. Is serious problems a code word for black kids? I think it is. I think it is, Movie Bob. How dare you refer to our Afro American brothers as problems?
Me. I was in the principal's office a lot, and so were my parents. They tried therapy, but I developed an unhelpful hobby of reading about child psychiatry techniques and then either purposefully subverting them or smugly informing the therapist that I knew why he was doing what he was doing.
I'm gonna file that under shit that never happened. I don't think Movie Bob was smart enough to figure that out. I mean, is this supposed to be like a self-felt? Is this supposed to be him saying, I was a piece of shit and I've always been a piece of shit and I've never been a productive member of society?
Doing. I even had an EKG, which at least required me to stay up all night beforehand watching Nick at Night and playing Nintendo, so there was that. They recommended Ritalin and other mind-altering drugs. But my parents said no. I thank them at least once a month for that, sometimes more.
I wish was on Ritalin. Then I'd like lose some weight because of it. But
And amid all that, the most reliable escape I had was almost always Mario. While I could get bored with even my favorite movies or books after a while, the games were always a little bit different every time I played. So I played them. And watched the cartoons. And read the comics and the magazine.
I don't know, just this is reminding me of my childhood. Any of you guys ever read any of the David Eddings books, like the Belgariad, the Mallorean, like Pawn of Prophecy, Enchanter's Endgame, Cirrus of Kel, Guardians of the West, or the Sparhawk, the Alarium or whatever it's called series, the Hidden City, the Sapphire Rose, the Diamond Throne. I fucking love those. I reread those books probably like 6 or 7 times each. And then I read a whole bunch of Dragonlance books. And then I eventually got into Star Wars books.
Magazines. And filled my notebooks and sketch pads in the margins of my textbooks with Mario drawings. And felt my ears perk up when rumors began to swirl of Super Mario Brothers. 3 inches.
Also Dune. I reread the Dune books a number of times. Yeah, I would tend to alternate between that and like history books. I started really getting into history books when I was in high school.
When it came to Mario, the rest of the world was about to catch up to me. 31. Super Mario Brothers. 3. Brick by brick, the third age. The lead up to the release of SMB3 was unprecedented in video game launches and definitely exceeded the pageantry surrounding the release of anything I was ever intensely interested in. Sporting events, holidays and certain movies got big, overblown coverage. Not video games not until now, but I never heard anything real about the making of one outside of my own fevered, Nintendo-saturated imagination. The news came from encountering a fellow gamer at the campground at our fort.
Like, is this thing a cry for help? He's like, I was mentally ill. I had this unhealthy obsession with Mario. I was hallucinating. I couldn't remember like large portions of my childhood. My parents sent me for therapy.
4th yearly family trip to New Hampshire. He said he'd seen a Japanese magazine showing Mario 3. He said Mario turned into a raccoon, or something. What? My first look at it came from, where else? Nintendo Power, a short puff piece that was, in my mind, akin to a vision from God. Mario had a
This dude has issues.
Mario had a raccoon tail. It made him fly. He would dress like a frog. Bowser was back and had children. This was also the first time I ever saw behind-the-scenes game development images. It may even have been the first time that I was conscious of Shigeru Miyamoto's existence as Mario's creator, and I recall buying a bunch of graph paper when I saw that was how the designers were plotting out sprite art. Actual news about the game came out in an agonizing trickle, but that didn't stop the hype from continuing to build. Local news shows ran interviews with excited store owners. Magazines that weren't about games.
Yeah, when I was in grade school and high school, I loved fantasy and sci-fi books. I would read them like constantly, just heading through them. I always asked my mother to go to the bookstore, and then I eventually got into I liked reference books a lot, like those big thick history books that would be like almost kind of like an encyclopedia that covered something over time. I enjoyed those a lot as well. I didn't really start reading horror stuff until university.
Games reported on it. Every kid I knew was excited about it. And then there was a movie, Man Behind the Curtain. The Wizard is a fairly terrible movie, and also one of the most bizarre examples of a children's film ever produced. The plot is a shameless, beat-for-beat rip-off of Rain Man, recast with pre-teens. A kid, Fred Savage, breaks his younger brother out of an institution. He's suffering from a Riguela-defined traumatic disorder, and, after discovering that said brother has an almost superhuman aptitude for video game playing, he's the wizard of the title, schemes to hustle their way to Las Vegas so the kid can prove his sanity by competing in a gigantic gaming competition. Like other hobby movies of the 80s, Red for BMX bikers, Gleaming the Cube for skateboarders, it was prefixed on wish fulfillment and pandering lionization, presenting the world as young gamers wished it could be. Games were everywhere, a big enough part of the world that massive, 32, Bob Chipman crowds would assemble for a competition, but also still large enough that gaming skills could help you thwart the will of clueless adults. For the most part, however, it's kind of a dark downer of a movie. Sad kids, angry parents, bleak backstories, and end of the 80s ennui.
Ennui, I think, is something that he got from um I feel like he got that from the thesaurus.
Oh, and it's a Nintendo commercial, too. Most movies about video games just made up their own rather than pay licensing fees, but Nintendo was behind this one, so their products and services were everywhere. Not only were the kids and adults always finding an excuse to play Nintendo games, but a nasty bad kid antagonist wields the notoriously clunky Power Glove controller like a Bond nemesis is showing off his doomsday weapon, and the Nintendo Power Game Counselors, a Typlan you...
Once again, this feels a lot like he watched the Nostalgia Critic and the AVGN's coverage of this and just took their takes.
Typlan you could call for help with any game, got a shout out as well, but the real star attraction? Super Mario Bros. 3, even with a Nintendo connection, the wizard probably would have passed without much notice. But Nintendo and the producers had a secret weapon. The first gameplay footage of SMB3 would be revealed to Western audiences through this movie. And they made sure everyone knew about it. So, on December 15, 1989, me and hundreds of thousands of other kids across America lined up for the wizard. I'll admit that I was among those who fooled themselves into thinking it was a great movie for years afterwards. But on that day all we really wanted was to get SMB3 in front of our eyeballs. Just let us see it. Please, just let us see it. Now, having watched the film much more often than it deserves since then, I can likely quote about 80% of it chapter and verse. You got 50,000 points in Double Dragon. I love the Power Glove. It's so bad. Video. ARRR Majadoon. He touched my breasts. California. But the climactic reveal of SMB3 is burned seared into my memory the way JFK's assassination was for my parents' generation. Or the way 9/11 would be for mine a scant 12 years from then.
You can't see my face right now, but yeah. Um, I don't. Do I really need to comment on that? It was his 9/11. It was his JFK
My
assassination.
God. Was it really only 12 years? In any case, the climactic reveal of SMB3 and the Wizard is an all-time marvel in the theater of the absurd. The Wizard stands stone-faced and emotionless on a preposterously over-designed stage, all smoke, lasers and futuristic set dressing, alongside his rivals, the Power Glove Guy and the young woman. Behind them, a huge stadium crowd cheering. In front of them, towering screens displaying their individual game progress. The unctuous MC calls for quiet as he announces that the final,
Unctuous sounds like a thesaurus word.
deciding match will test the competitors against a game that they have never, ever played before. In the crowd, the Wizard's family and road trip allies are struck with fear, believing his special gift contingent on his 33 Super Mario Bros. 3. Brick-by-brick familiarity with the games he plays to the exclusion of all other extrovert engagement. Back up on the stage, the MC's guttural bellow proclaims the words, Super Mario Bros. 3, and there it is. The title screen. The flashing yellow 3. A map screen in a Mario game? The Troopas are back. The Goombas, too. And question blocks. Yes. The raccoon tail, we didn't know to call it a tanuki yet, exists, and it does make you fly. Was that a giant Goomba? In the film, the Rocky-esque suspenseful score drowns out the game's sounds, but in the theater the audience drowns out the film's very tone. This is meant to be a tense, will he or won't he contest to earn the happy ending, but we couldn't care less. This is what we came for. It's arrived. Our victory is achieved. Across the country we sat there, jaws agape and hearts racing, as the most important thing that had ever happened blazed across the screen and before our eyes months before any of us would be playing it. Oh, the Wizard wins, by the way, proving his mettle and reuniting his broken family. Not that anyone really cared. Super Mario Bros. 3 was real. We'd seen it. Now we just had to keep waiting to play it. The Mountaintop SMB3 came out on February 12, 1990, and, thanks to my sainted mother, within a few days I had a copy of my very own to play. For once I was the actual first on my block, and within my own circle of friends, to have it, since the subsequent bulk of this book is dedicated in part to my memories of playing through the game, I'll avoid preemptively repeating myself here. Instead, I'll try to convey as best I'm able what every other part of my world, gaming and otherwise, was like outside the game. What sticks out?
So I put up a poll. I don't know if it's really I explained it very well, but the question is this like all supposed to be serious? Like the stuff about this being his 9/11, or is this like a joke? Cuz I actually feel like this is mostly serious. Um like that he this is how much it actually meant to him.
What I remember most of all, was that this was the first time Mario peaked in the popular culture. The absolute height of his fame and renown during the period when he was the unquestioned king of video game heroes.
Didn't he just say that like 2 or 3 pages ago? He repeats himself a lot, and this isn't a long book.
Heroes, as such, it was the first, and, for a long period, last, time that the rest of the world and I were almost in sync. SMB3 was the children's media story of the moment, the first opinion poll showing that kids worldwide recognized Mario equally or more so than Mickey Mouse were being breathlessly touted as "Hey boomers, you got old." Newswire puff pieces, and the rest of the world was finally waking up to what my generation of youngsters, and none more so than me, had known for years. The little fat guy with the mustache and the overalls was the coolest thing on the planet.
I don't know, dude. This is fucked.
34. Bob Chipman. The Super Show had long since slipped from first-run airwaves, but a new series based exclusively on SMB3 had taken its place not in syndication, but in a Prime Network Saturday morning spot. There were Mario t-shirts, toys, and knickknacks in real stores, not just game-centric outlets or gray market import shops. Morning news shows covered the phenomena. There was even an SMB3 Happy Meal at McDonald's, the ultimate symbol of something having made it, to an 8-year-old, at least. All in all, It felt a little bit like at least some of the differences between me and the rest of the world might have just been a matter of me being ahead of the curve, and now everything else was catching up.
See, movie Bob was super big. Was super big brained even back then. He was years ahead of everybody else. Okay, here it comes. Here comes the most insane part of the book.
Up. This, I thought, was the beginning of a new and better world. It was actually the beginning of the end. A boy Joey's to war. Marketing, especially youth marketing, in the 90s was all about dividing and conquering, establishing an identity for your product, encouraging a less attractive identity for a rival product, and getting consumers to flock to you to claim that good identity for themselves. We got a taste of this in the 80s with the Cola Wars, and Nike essentially started a race war among my sports fan friends by selling the Magic shoe and the Bird shoe concurrently at the height of the Celtics-Lakers rivalry. But it was the great console war of the 90s that first drew me into that kind of corporate-manipulated madness. As the new decade dawned, Nintendo had released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. I got mine for making it out of the 5th grade without a single grade below a C.
Single grade below a C. Okay.
The triumph of lowered expectations.
Just felt it. He's just felting himself. He's just like throwing his chips into the pile.
Expectations. And with it Super Mario World. I still insisted on calling it Super Mario Brothers. 4. Super Mario World until Super Mario World 2. Yoshi's Island ended my hopes of seeing the series numbers climb into the double digits. I played the hell out of SMW, obviously, and while I loved those gorgeous 16-bit graphics, the expanded number of buttons, and Yoshi the dinosaur most of all, I knew almost immediately that SMB3's By the Ironclad stature as my favorite game of all time was in no danger of being challenged. The cape wasn't as cool as the tail, and I missed all the fun power-up suits, but whatever. It was the 90s. Video games had arrived as the coolest ticket in popular culture. The
level of delusion, he thinks he's cool.
Culture. The arcades were in the midst of a brand new boom, driven largely by a new generation of more violent games aimed at teenagers.
I'm gonna be honest, I always hated arcades as a kid, just because A, I'm bad at video games, B, they were just super expensive and the games didn't last very long.
Teenagers, Mario and Nintendo were the acknowledged kings of video games, and Bob Chipman, formerly Bob the Dork who's way too into 35, Super Mario Brothers. 3. Brick by brick, his dorky video games, was now Bob the guy who knows everything about the world's hottest new pastime. Why?
So Bob Chipman the peak of his life was in the mid-90s when he knew all this stuff about Mario.
Why? Yes, ma'am. I can tell you the best place to build up your EXP in Final Fantasy. What's that, sir? You can't quite make it through TMNT2? Let me show you a code that might help. Pathetic fantasies, even for a 10-year-old, but that's really how I figured things were going. Hell, maybe that's how they were for just a moment, but that moment, my moment, didn't last.
It was his moment. His moment. The only time in his life he was ever happy.
The Sega Corporation had always existed as Nintendo's principal U.S. rival. Others had come and gone. For a minute there we were all excited about the TurboGrafx-16. Ask your parents how that worked out, but they were the constant. Not so much a Pepsi as a brand X with a small but loyal following. Their Genesis console had been out for a few years already, touting its 16-bit graphics versus the NES and dipping a toe into the waters of combative marketing with the Genesis Does What Nintendo campaign. But they never had a Mario, with apologies to Alex Kidd fans. No, just no, and they never had any momentum beyond that of the loyal opposition. But when the
I feel like that is something else that he pulled from that.
The SNES hit, removing the one advantage the Genesis had, Sega decided to go big or go home. Sega declared war, with the instantly popular Sonic the Hedgehog as their new mascot. Sega marketing switched gears from passively lauding what their products offered to aggressively attacking what Nintendo's didn't. It was, I realize now, a brilliant strategy. While games had never been bigger, the generation of kids who'd made them big, my generation, were aging into double digits and soon their teens, where the pressure to cast aside childish things could have spelled doom the medium. Even though they were still mostly pumping out the same animal mascot, anime-styled adventure and sci-fi fantasy curios that had dominated gaming up to that point, by positioning the Genesis as the cool, and, by extension, more mature alternative to Nintendo and Mario, Sega was making it okay to keep your game console plugged in even as you started shoving your Ninja Turtles and G.I. Joes to the back of the closet, or the front of the yard sale.
I don't know. I don't know, Bob. Like, what kind of loser or F-slur would, as they grow up, continue to like video games made by Nintendo that had animal mascots? It took place in a sci-fi fantasy session. You'd have to be pretty retarded to stay a fan of that into your adulthood.
Sale. Nintendo responded to the war by battening down the hatches, taking almost no shots in their ads and relying on the potency of their longtime fans' devotion to carry them. This would become their definitive corporate behavior for years to come. Sega's campaign, on the other hand, was relentless and blunt in the way that only 1990s salesmanship could be. In Genesis commercials, sleazy store owners tried to steer customers away from the sleek, sexy Genesis toward the disinteresting SNES. While Estati, 36, Bob Chipman old maid censor mock blasted Sonic while wondering, why can't he be more like that nice boy, Mario? In playgrounds and schoolyards across the country, young gamers chose sides and memorized their talking points for a while there. I was able to rattle off the exact numerical superiority of the SNES's on-screen color palette and the advantages of Mode 7 scaling and rotation capabilities, but it didn't matter. Sega wasn't selling games, they were selling a label, a shoebox-sized chunk of plastic and microchips that said you were on the cool team. Nintendo, playing the long odds, did themselves no short-term favors by maintaining a strict family-friendly image just as violent games were becoming the rage in arcades. When it came time to port Mortal Kombat to home consoles, they handed Sega the mother of all PR. Victories when Nintendo opted for a bloodless, censored version while Genesis offered an authentic translation. Just like that, my life was the ending of a downer Twilight Zone episode, video games were in. And I was still out for a brand new reason.
Like, so his life, he was cool for approximately a day, and then he went back to being a loser. Once again, this is like I don't know if he has a humiliation fetish or what the point of this book is.
In case you're wondering, it would never have crossed my mind to try begging mom and dad for a Genesis, since they'd never go for it in those days. Having two game consoles was seen as an almost profane extravagance for a child, like having a weekend bike in addition to your everyday one. I think I had one friend who had both, and it was because his parents were divorced and his SNES lived at his father's house. Besides, I was Team Mario. Sega wasn't just his enemy, it was mine too. To a 12-year-old, that made sense. Hitting the wall. Outside the gaming world itself, the cultural import of Mario and friends seemed to be waning. In 1991 a new cartoon based on Super Mario World came and went, and even my overly forgiving eyes knew it was awful. Sonic had two series at the same time, both popular and one, running on Saturday mornings, that's still remembered as one of the better cartoons of the 90s. Meanwhile, consoles were no longer
Does anyone remember Sonic Underground? That was Kino.
longer exclusively driving the penetration of gaming franchises into the popular culture. Arcades were in the beginning of what would be their last big hurrah, and mega-popular series like the aforementioned Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter II were enthralling the popular imagination. Video games had never been more visible outside of their original niche. But it was looking as though Mario might be slipping into the background, a bygone hero from a bygone age, unless, of course, he could be the one who conquered the one height of 37. Super Mario Bros. 3. Brick-by-brick mainstream success that no other game hero had successfully surmounted. Hollywood. In 1993 there was Super Mario Bros. The movie, a live-action mess that barely resembled the games and that I prepared for with a zeal matching that for the Wizard. It was terrible, a generic 90s junkyard sci-fi dud in the mold of Johnny Mnemonic that failed so spectacularly at the box office and so profoundly horrified Nintendo and Miyamoto that they are reputed to have turned down every American movie and TV offer since. These are things I know now, of course. When I first read an official confirmation of an honest-to-goodness Mario movie in the pages of Mario Mania and SMW strategy guide from Nintendo.
Anyone remember the Metroid movie that John Woo was gonna make and never wound up making? Yeah, I don't either.
Nintendo Power that included a 32-page character retrospective which I reread often enough to qualify it as an unofficial precursor to this book. All I could feel was excitement. Finally, that there would one day be a live-action Mario movie had been a dream and an inevitability as long as I could remember. He-Man had a movie. Superman and Batman both had movies. Hell, Teddy Ruxpin had a live-action movie. Great things got movies. Mario was the greatest thing, so Mario would get a movie, and I'd get to see the Mushroom Kingdom looking as grand and astonishing as I'd always imagined it. So when I read this official announcement from Nintendo Power, surely the only trustworthy source on such matters, I was elated not so much by discovery as by nearness. I was already waiting, and now my wait was almost over. These were the days before the internet, and thus there was no way for me to access any further news about the most important movie of all time other than its being made in between first hearing about it and glimpsing the first trailers and stills over a year later. But that was okay. I knew Mario, and I'd grown up in the golden age of fantasy movies, so I knew what this movie of my dreams had to look like: a sprawling, colorful Mushroom Kingdom. Bowser's domain, all fire and brimstone. Mario and Luigi in their overalls and caps, charging through forests and tundra fighting live-action versions of the classic enemies. A beautiful flesh and blood Princess Toadstool. It would be another few years before Americans knew her real name was Peach. Toad. Probably some kind of Jim Henson creation, or perhaps a little person in prosthetic makeup. My mind was alive, at all times, wondering what form the characters, creatures and locations would take when finally rendered in the flesh. I couldn't wait to see what kind of animatronic effects were going to be employed to create the Troopas. Would they be animalistic, stomping around on all fours like an SMB1 and 3? Or upright walking like an SMW? That second option might be best, I thought at the time. Upright walking turtles, 38. Bob Chipman had worked in the Ninja Turtles movies, and would be big for fight scenes. What about the power-ups? Obviously, the SMB3 super suits wouldn't be in the first movie. But surely they'd need to use fire flowers. Would Fire Mario be white and red like SMB1 and World, or the orange scheme from SMB3? If only I knew. It took over a year to see or hear anything else from it, and every tiny scrap of information that could be gleaned was less promising than the last. And only served to push me to further denial. The Mushroom Kingdom, or was it something else now? Was going to look like a modern city? Bowser/Koopa was just going to look like a human? No Troopas? The Goombas were big guys with tiny heads for some reason? Luigi with no mustache? Granted, these were the days before 2012's The Avengers, where you had no reason to expect an adaptation of something like Super Mario Bros. To look anywhere near close to its source. But this was ridiculous. No. I'd tell myself. It'll work. It'll be good. They have to change some things to make them work with real actors. This is the Mario movie, and the Mario movie will be great because it deserves to be. Why would they make it if they didn't understand that? I read everything I could about it, which in those days meant magazine articles that recycled the same handful of publicity stills and self-serving quotes from the filmmakers. I convinced myself, in spite of the natural inclination toward skepticism that infused every other aspect of my life, that this was going to work. That in spite of all the revisions, was it really that different from the Koopalings having different names in the SMB3 cartoon? This version of Mario would simply be epic and awesome. Just in a different way, it had to be. It just had to be. That's what I told myself as a friend, and I headed in to watch it opening weekend. Somehow managing to not register that neither the celebratory atmosphere that had surrounded the wizard nor the large crowds for the same were decidedly not present. How could I notice anyone or anything else in the world that day? I was going to see the Mario movie. I was going to see Super Mario Bros., the movie. The film more or less follows the lore as it was generally understood at the time, with the details altered to make it A, filmable on a budget, and B, able to ride the coattails of the dinosaur phenomenon kicked off by Jurassic Park. Mario and Luigi are still
Land Before Time was fucking based, and I don't care what anyone has to say about it.
plumbers from Brooklyn, but the Mushroom Kingdom is replaced by Dino Hutton, a post-apocalyptic-looking version of NYC inhabited by the humanoid descendants of dinosaurs zapped there by the meteor that supposedly wiped the species out on Earth. Bob Hoskins, respected British actor best known to Americans for Who, 39, Super Mario Bros. 3, Brick by Brick, framed Roger Rabbit, was Mario, and does a reasonably decent job of it. While then mostly unknown, outside of the New York underground comedy circuit, John Leguizamo was Luigi. Samantha Mathis was Princess Daisy, named for the female protagonist of the Mario Land titles on the Game Boy, a Brooklyn archaeology student who turns out to be the exiled ruler of Dino Hutton, and Dennis Hopper was President Koopa, who's supposed to be an evolved T-Rex but doesn't look like one until a few seconds at the very end. It's a horrible, horrible movie, stage-bound, badly acted,
Fuck you, it's
nonsensical,
awesome.
and cheap-looking even for 1993. Years later, it'll come out that the production was so badly managed that the actors threw out their scripts and everything just started getting worked out as they went. Hoskins and Leguizamo would go on to publicly trash the film, which bombed at the box office, and it felt like Mathis' career never fully recovered. As of this writing, she most recently featured in the box office dubbed Atlas Shrugged, Part 2. Naturally, I convinced myself that it was good, not only good, but great. I reviewed it, positively, in much greater detail and to much more positivity than it deserved for the school paper. I zeroed in on the good stuff. They, eventually, wore the right colors. Live-action Yoshi. That dinosaur humanoid evolution business was kind of interesting. Wasn't it? There was a bob-omb. The ending promised a sequel, but I didn't wait around. I made my own, animated via D-Paint on my old Amiga, imagining how the plots of SMB2 and SMB3 might be adapted into the movie's universe. I needed it to be good, because I needed Mario to be as big and meaningful a movie franchise as he'd been in gaming. Getting of the movie was forever. It meant that the character and the story mattered beyond being some brief fad. Mario was not a pet rock, damn it, he was my friend, the thing that was getting me through the misery of pre-adolescence.
Holy shit. The thing that was getting him through the misery of pre-adolescence. Just, I don't know.
Pre-adolescence. I needed him to matter so that the time and energy I'd invested into him mattered, but the film was a flop. A bad movie that died a quick box office death and heralded a run of awful video game-based movies, Double Dragon, Street Fighter, etc., of which the
Okay, so Base Caulfield, what we're gonna get to is he is going to play through every single Super Mario Brothers 3 level and describe them in great detail. He's just, for whatever reason, not doing that here. But yeah, like, the book isn't that bad. It's funny though. It's funny, and it shows that like how fucked up movie Bob is. Once again, if this was like a comedy, this would be really funny.
Mortal Kombat was the only thing close to successful, financially, anyway. The movies, and movie audiences, have spoken. Video games, even Mario, weren't ready for the big leagues. And eventually, even I had to admit it, it was a harbinger. Things were changing. And not in a good way. 40. Bob Chipman, Things Fall Apart, high school, and junior high before it, was not quite the party that Saved by the Bell and John Hughes had promised my generation, to say the least. I was still locked into the Catholic school track, My brother would be in junior high before our parents figured out it just wasn't worth it, but whereas my primary
Because they realized like that you were a failure and you always would be a failure.
primary school had been an uneventful little place, my high school was another story, private and Catholic, but still very much downtown, mostly populated by Italian, Irish and Greek hoodlums whose families mainly paid tuition to keep them from having to go to the same schools as the somehow worse black and Latino hoodlums. In my memories, the great console wars drag on like my own private Vietnam. And it didn't help that I was still constantly in trouble at school and in and out of therapy at the time for anger, attention and authority issues. However, it really only lasted a couple of years.
How fucking amazing is that? Like his own Vietnam. Got so hard. His own thing is, I feel like he's serious about it. Like his parents stopped sending him to Catholic school because he realized that he was such a loser that he would never amount to anything and it wasn't worth it. Worse black and Latino hoodlums. I don't know, Bob. You didn't have to go to school with the black and Latino hoodlums. Like so basically the console wars were such a drain on him. He had like anger, attention and authority issues because the teachers were trying to like teach him stuff and he would start talking about Mario and they tell him to stop talking about Mario and he just freak out and start screaming autistically screaming at them. That's the impression that I get from this.
In my memories, the great console wars drag on like my own private Vietnam, and it didn't help that I was still constantly in trouble at school and in and out of therapy at the time for anger, attention and authority issues. However, it really only lasted a couple of years. In 1994 the Sony PlayStation came out. Unlike countless third challenger consoles before, it stuck around. The war was now more of a scattershot fracas, and since this was the booming Clinton economy it was less unusual to see more than one brand of console to a household, particularly since Generation NES was speeding toward young adulthood with pockets full of their own disposable income. The identity conflict of the Mario vs. Sonic days gave way to a maturity conflict. Sony, the first
Someone needs to do a parody of Blue Oyster Cult's Psychic Wars, veteran of the Psychic Wars, like veteran of the console wars. The identity. I like how this is identity. This is how I grew up.
first successful challenger from outside the gaming-only business, built the PlayStation, which, for reasons I forget, we felt obligated to shorthand as PSX at the time, to look more like a VCR or stereo from a distance and utilize CDs instead of cartridges. That plus marketing campaigns emphasizing sports sims and other games targeted at older teens and college students drew a stark contrast between their machine and those from Nintendo or Sega with their candy-colored exteriors, toy guns and inescapable legacy as having originated as childhood playthings. The symbolism was unavoidable. PlayStation Gaming said I'm a gamer, but I've grown up. Still having your SNES plugged in? You might as well still be sleeping with a teddy bear. What made it especially rough, not as rough, I stress, as the more universal miseries of junior high and high school life, for me was how true that symbolism actually was. To be a geek about anything usually requires a level of investment that originates most often in childhood, meaning that geek culture is largely a culture of people holding on to vestigial pieces of their own childhoods. I still played video games because I still love them. 41, Super Mario Bros. 3, Brick by Brick, and I still love them because I'd loved them as a kid and they allowed me to revisit that feeling, especially the ones, like Mario games, that were a direct connection to that golden age where I'd first discovered them. 2 Mario games released en route to the waning days of the SNES, though, would have the whiplash-inducing effect of plunging me deeper into my fixation while simultaneously chipping away at my ability to view them as something beyond the diversions that they were. Super Mario RPG and Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island. Gaming culture had long since led me to the other stratas of nerdom, and introduced obsessions like continuity into my psyche. In my mind, the Mario games had always had an epic saga playing out in the margins, But it was increasingly hard to ignore that such depth wasn't to be found in the games. Super Mario RPG, however, finally delivered a Mario game with the kind of sprawling story and epic scope I'd always imagined was there. It was a standard Final Fantasy-style JRPG, J for Japanese, but populated by Mario characters. The game sent its heroes, including Bowser at one point, off on a quest to defeat a new enemy who'd swept down from space. It enthralled me and, however brief,
I have Super Mario RPG, like the remake. I'm gonna have to play more of it. I just haven't really gotten around to it, which is sad because I got it for Christmas and it's been half a year and I just haven't. But I'm gonna have to play it. The nice thing about playing my Switch is I can put on an audiobook when I do it, and I'm not tempted as much to just watch YouTube videos or something like that. So last time I was doing that, I was going through a I forget what it was.
briefly, re-solidified my commitment to the series' mythos. I hadn't outgrown Mario. He was growing with me, following my lead, but still there for me. And then came Yoshi's Island, the game that was initially advertised as Super Mario World 2. Yoshi's Island is today remembered as one of Miyamoto's masterworks, a triumph on every level of game design. The history of its production is legend, taken aback by a Nintendo boss's suggestion that he make the game's appearance less cartoony and more like Donkey Kong Country, a spin-off series that used pre-rendered 3D images as sprites to try and match the graphical power of the emerging CD-based consoles. Miyamoto doubled down and ordered that the game's visuals be tweaked to resemble children's crayon drawings. The result, a mega-selling, award-winning classic and a stern reminder to Nintendo not to question their golden boy. While it was a game I love then and adore today, at the time it was the Mario game that, well, that sort of broke my brain just a bit, and served as an early signal that my relationship with Mario and his world was fundamentally changing whether I wanted it to or not. Like SMRPG, Yoshi's Island offered the tantalizing prospect of a more narrative-oriented Mario adventure and the irresistible idea of finally setting up a Super Mario Bros. Continuity. The game was a prequel, set long before the events of even Donkey Kong, presumably, wherein the wizard caretaker of a still infant baby Bowser foresees the coming of the Mario Brothers, 42, Bob Chipman and schemes to kidnap them as babies, from the stork. Since this is a Mario game, to change history.
Okay, guys, we're coming up on the existential crisis. Okay, Movie Bob is about to have an existential crisis and, like, basically go into suicide mode. It's gonna be fucking amazing.
History. Things go wrong, and baby Mario winds up in the care of Yoshi. Whoa. They'd actually met before. On a quest to rescue his brother, the idea of seeing Mario's origin story had me playing through this game like a man possessed, even though by that point a teenage's social life was leaving less and less time for gaming.
Look, dude, you had no teenage social life. Let's not pretend.
Gaming. I knew the end. I figured Mario and Luigi would find their way back to Brooklyn. Along with seeing their Earthrealm digs visualized for the first time in a game, I was intrigued to see if any indications would be made about how and why they found their way back to Mushroom Kingdom years later. The possibilities. And so, after a climactic battle against a towering, Godzilla-sized Bowser, another image I'd always wanted to see, I settled in to watch as the game's ending credits played out over an animation of the stork flying baby Mario and Luigi back home. Any moment now, I just knew I'd see a 16-bit New York skyline come into view. But, instead, the closing text and final image tell a different story, as the brothers are delivered to where Mom and Dad live, the Mushroom Kingdom. What, Mario and Luigi were born in the Mushroom Kingdom? That doesn't make any sense. How'd they grow up in Brooklyn, then? Were they sent there at some point, like Superman, unaware of their real origins? And how were they Italian Americans if they came from a world with no Italy and no America? Ooh. Maybe that'll be the plot of the next game. Maybe. I didn't have a breakdown or anything. It's not as though I was knocked into some kind of system shock over this. But the dissonance stuck with me for a while. By now I had more important things to worry about in school and life to be completely consumed by this. College prep classes,
You didn't get into college.
girls,
No girl would ever be interested in you.
sex,
You're an incel.
drugs and social hierarchy were giving me my headaches. High school, after all. If I'd learned to keep my Nintendo worship, relatively, in check and the Sega is cooler days, I could hold it back for the age of everything but PlayStation is for kids. Mario games had been my thing, my refuge from everything else when I
My refuge from everything.
needed them. Now that refuge was tinged, ever so slightly, with doubt. It wasn't that Not From Brooklyn changed anything fundamental, but it felt so cavalier. That it wasn't presented as a surprise drove home the reminder that most of what Generation NES considered canon for its games was often just hastily composed faux mythos for US ad copy. And part of the story I'd been devoted to might have just been a narrative placeholder for 43. Super Mario Bros. 3, Brick by Brick, Nintendo. There's a moment, vitally important in the development of any geek, nerd or whatever else you want to call it, when it finally sinks in all the way that the people creating whatever character or property you've let colonize a part of your imagination just aren't as devoted to it as you are that, to them, it's a job. For me, this was it. How much sense did it make to be trying to work out the bigger relationships between the characters and the broader scope of their world? What was...
Wait, he had timelines for Mario? I mean, I know there was like the whole Zelda timeline autism, but for Mario? He thought it was like this deep, like philosophical. It's just insane. Like he literally had a an existential crisis because of Mario 2. Because of Mario was not from Brooklyn.
What was the point of keeping meticulous mental, and, yes, also physical, lists and chronologies of Mario's friends, enemies, worlds, abilities, all that? What did it matter if I could point out, on a moment's notice, that no Cobbins, exploding shell troopers, were only found in Sarah's Island and only in one game? Why should I put so much of myself into this? When Mario's masters couldn't even keep his origins straight, it all happened so gradually, and in the background of so many bigger things, that it didn't register until much later, but this was probably a turning point for me as much as it was for Mario. Young adulthood now coming into full effect. It was the best possible time to free up some mental space now that school and life choices were going to start counting for something. I had college to get ready for, and a career path to start actually charting. I'd long since transitioned from filmmaking to game designing as a dream trajectory. It was time to move on, if only a bit, from Mario and Nintendo, just not all at once. The last...
It's amazing. It's just incredible. They had this full-on existential crisis. Like, do I really even need to comment on that? I think that largely speaks for itself.
The Last Stand. In 1996 I was a sophomore in high school. Bill Clinton was dutifully pretending that Bob Dole presented any kind of challenge to his second presidential term. But for me and millions of other still playing Generation NES gamers, the biggest thing happening was the Nintendo 64. The path into this next generation of consoles had been an awkward one for the house Miyamoto built and a trying time for their stalwart fans.
The house Miyamoto built.
After a series of fits and starts that included the disastrous Virtual Boy platform, Nintendo wound up skipping the 32-bit race entirely, getting by on the success of mega hits like Donkey Kong Country and Yoshi's Island while bolstered by the aging SNES's stability in a market that was otherwise in total chaos. Sega's Genesis had collapsed under the weight of poorly realized peripherals.
It was total chaos, but out of the total chaos, Nintendo brought order. Order and stability. The declaration of the new Nintendo order.
Poorly realized peripherals, and their two subsequent consoles, Sega CD and Saturn, en route to 1999's Dreamcast, suffered from poor sales in North America. The PlayStation was moving units but hadn't quite landed a killer app of its own. 44. Bob Chipman. So it was announced with some fanfare that their next console would leap ahead into the 64-bit realm, and would use the new power to take video games all the way into the third dimension. And, as ever, Mario would lead the way. Of course, 3D had
Like Voltron the Third Dimension. Does anyone remember Voltron the Third Dimension? That was Kino.
3D had a place in gaming from the very beginning. Vector-based arcade titles like Star Wars made shapes from glowing lines. PC fare like Wolfenstein and Doom sent players wandering down flatly decorated hallways made from perspective warp 2D surfaces, and SNES titles like Mario Kart and Pilotwings simulated three-dimensional space via Mode 7 scaling and rotation. But the early images of Super Mario 64, in those days, gamer culture really was so insular that no one thought anything of naming a game after its bit count, that were slowly creeping out from the pages of Nintendo Power, and the primordial form of the internet promised something more, a fully realized mushroom kingdom, explorable by a Mario who existed as a solid digital being. Truly, this was
A solid, like he speaks about Mario like it's the incarnation of Christ. Like Mario existed with Shigeru Miyamoto, who was God the Father, and he proceeded from God the Father to become a physical being. That like the N64 literally brought Mario to life.
was hope for the future personified. Open exploration of a full virtual world, the dream of gaming from the beginning, would finally be realized. By a
Does anyone remember Quest 64? Quest 64 was awesome. Does anyone remember Mystical Ninja starring Goham with the Impact song? I'd play the Impact song, but I get a copyright strike.
by a Mario game. As it should be. The future of video games would remain in what I still, after all that time, felt were its rightful hands. Super Mario 64 was, of course, a thing of beauty. No challenger to SMB3 in my heart, of course, but a worthy successor if Mario side-scrolling had peaked. For me, with a Tanuki's suit, then SM64 would be fine as the first lunge into a new era. It was the first time in forever that a game was so aesthetically comfortable I was desperate to not finish it, just making Mario run and jump around the elaborately constructed game world, exploring every cave and scaling every tower just to see what might be found. In my youth, I wanted nothing more than to spend hours simply inhabiting Mario's world, and now I could. And if such a massive undertaking as this, the game world was unprecedentedly huge, for the time, was merely the first step, one could only imagine what might come next. Let the others have their, undoubtedly, short-term fads of raiding tombs and crashing bandicoots. Mario was back. And this was, we were sure, the future.
Dude, this guy has Arrested Development. And I'm saying this as a dude with an Espeon avatar. Like this had Arrested Development. Like this dude has issues. Mario is literally his religion. Like 3D Mario is literally the incarnation of Jesus. Shigeru Miyamoto is God the Father. Mario is God the Son. I don't know who the Holy Spirit would be in this. But I don't know. You know what? Maybe this book should be like conversion therapy. Like you show this to someone who likes video games, like to get kids to stop being addicted to video games. Like if you play too many video games, you'll turn into movie Bob Chipman, and no one wants to be movie Bob Chipman. Maybe like that is the purpose. Maybe this book can find a second lease on life. That like you don't want to turn out like movie Bob where you have an existential crisis upon finding out Mario's not from Brooklyn. Now, to be fair to movie Bob, I'm still pissed off that Disney retconned the entire Star Wars extended universe and gave us the shit that was the sequel reboot trilogy. That they got rid of literally all of that, like all the cool stuff, the Imperial Civil War. They got rid of KOTOR. They got rid of all the Sith lore. they got away. They did got rid of all the like the cool stuff. They ruined Han and Leia's relationship. So to be fair, I got pissed off about that, and I'm still bitter about that. That there's not going to be more Star Wars books set in the extended universe. I'm also salty that what happened with Korra and like how it completely ruined Avatar, The Last Airbender. Like Avatar: The Last Airbender, like if we want to be cringy about it, it was about national independence. It was about countries and peoples having their own sovereignty and being left alone. And then it turns into this gay like globalist thing.
Future, but, in reality, it was the beginning of the end. No one, least of all Nintendo diehards awestruck by the experience of brawling with Bowser in 3D, could have guessed it at the time, but Super Mario 64 would be the last, brief moment for at least a decade that a Mario game was the most important thing happening in video games. 45. Super Mario Bros. 3. Brick by brick, desertion. To date, I don't know that there's ever been a more perfect symbiosis of hardware and software in the history of gaming as Super Mario 64 and then
It's the apotheosis. It's the hypostatic union. It is hardware and software in symbiosis. It is Super Mario 64. It is the hypostatic union of hardware and software. Also, why did they have to make Toph into a thought? Toph was my favorite character in the OG. I don't know, like Toph just doesn't really seem like that to me. She seems like the kind of girl who has really high standards, but if you could like win her heart because you were a Giga Chad, then she'd be yours forever.
the Nintendo 64. As though everything about the machine had been designed solely to optimize this one perfect game. As it turned out, that might have been part of what went wrong. The N64 was made to showcase Nintendo's self-developed first-party marvels, and everyone else was just going to have to fall into line. Unfortunately for Nintendo, while they were busily consumed with crafting Miyamoto's 3D masterpiece, the world had changed. In the early
Like to me, the single biggest I'm sorry, we're just digressing slightly. The single biggest insult of the reboot is what it did to Han and Leia's relationship. Now, Han and Leia's relationship was kind of the I don't know the rock at the center of the post Endor extended universe. You had a book where Han kidnaps her. They eventually get married, and there's a lot of tragedy that happens. One of their kids falls to the dark side. Another one of them dies. Han goes through periods as a general again. Leia goes through periods as the chief of state, and stuff like that. But there is this deep love and affection between the two of them, and as they grow older together, they learn to lean on each other more. And it's a very successful and happy marriage, despite the all the stuff that was going on around them. And they just ruined that, and they made them into like this divorced boomer couple. Also, Luke is now this like depressed loser, like who never rebuilt the Jedi Order, when he's like the most optimistic, idealistic character, like maybe one of the most in fiction. Sorry, I just
In the early
it
90s,
irritates
the
me.
ability to store digital information on CD-ROM discs had revolutionized the home computer world. While PC gaming couldn't match the ease of access or the install base of consoles, it was clear to everyone that CDs were the future of video games. Everyone, that is, except Nintendo. Nintendo had always been partial to the cartridge chip format, in no small part because of the control it afforded them over third-party developers. Publicly, this was how they enforced.
You know what's something I find kind of sad? What they wound up doing with General Grievous. Because in the OG Star Wars Clone Wars, Grievous was like this unstoppable force of nature. He was just legitimately really scary.
enforce quality control so as to prevent market-saturating crashes like those that doomed Atari in the 80s.
I don't get what's so bad about. So the cartridges had some shortfallings in that they couldn't really support full motion video or voice. They did have the benefit of not having load times though, or very minimal load times. They also had the benefit of not needing memory cards, so you could save the game onto it, which back in the day was not insignificant. That was pretty cool. They were also a lot more robust than CDs, which tended, particularly back then, to get scratched. I don't think it's really necessarily a good decision or bad decision. I think it's just different. And it was just the way Nintendo decided to do it.
The 80s, but behind the scenes it was how they strong-armed developers. The publisher controlled the manufacturing and availability of the storage medium needed to put your game on shelves. CDs, already manufactured by dozens of outfits, would mean the end of that control. CDs also came with their own drawbacks, unable to write to themselves or access information without load times. They would have been ill-suited for the sprawling worlds Miyamoto and company wanted to create, such as SM64. And so the Nintendo 64 became the last of the cartridge-based consoles, a move that allowed for the creation of unparalleled masterworks like SM64.
The last of the cartridge-based consoles. What about Game Boy Advance? What about DS? What about 3DS? Those all use consoles. I like what? I mean, that those existed within this time frame. I mean, as we said, the PS2 and the DS are tied for the best selling console of all time. And it uses cartridges. My understanding is isn't the Game Boy Advance a 32-bit console? It's actually a lot more powerful than I thought it was. But like, I find with a lot of these older games, the main bottleneck isn't the game itself or the engine. It's that the console runs in such low res. Like, I did a playthrough of Lost Kingdoms and Dolphin, and just upscaling the resolution makes it look so much better. And I think that's true for a lot of these things. They actually look a lot better than they look like, because they're all running at like 480p or stuff like that.
SM64 and The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, itself often called the greatest game ever made by some to this day, but also ultimately doomed them. Developers who had been aching to bring the power of PC games to consoles were aghast at this. Unlike times before, however, they had a viable escape option. Sony was only too happy to...
Yeah, the Game Boy Advance had a horrible sound chip, its screen had issues, its controller had issues. But I find, like, especially having played games on the Virtual Console and emulators and stuff like that, the games themselves are really, really solid. And they even today look pretty good on, like, they just need some upscaling. But, yeah, I don't know why I'm ranting about it. Just, I love Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance SP is, like, oh, it was fucking amazing.
Happy to have them, and a sea change was signaled when Squaresoft announced that Final Fantasy, a mega-popular RPG franchise that had always lived under the Nintendo umbrella, was jumping ship to Sony for its 7th installment. For a time, veterans of the first console war like myself tried to mount a vain, half-hearted defense more out of nostalgia for the last conflict than 46. Bob Chipman passion for this one, but
the only non-Nintendo consoles I've ever got were, I had a Sega Genesis when I was really young, and I got an Xbox 360. Oh no, I've got a couple games. I got Xbox 360 for Halo. Bizarrely enough, for Symphony of the Night. Symphony of the Night was released on it. What else was there? Red Dead Redemption. There was a couple games I really wanted. And then I got a PS3 just for Got a PS3 just for Demon Souls and Persona 5.
But the writing was on the wall. Final Fantasy VII became an instant, generation-defining classic. More and more long-time Nintendo developers bailed from the good ship Mario, and it soon became clear that the hemorrhaging of games and gamers from Nintendo was not going to stop. Instead of being the beginning of a new era, Super Mario 64 wound up being Mario's last big traditional game for a while, his only adventure title, outside of the offbeat RPG Paper Mario on the N64. Mascot multiplayer games would be his jurisdiction for the rest of the console's lifespan. Mario Kart 64, 3 entries in the Mario Party virtual board game series, and, perhaps most importantly, Super Smash Bros., a fighting game whose roster was comprised of Nintendo characters, an idea I was hoping someone would execute for as long as I'd been gaming. But by then reality was crystallizing. My brother and I had a PlayStation and even the ill-fated Dreamcast, and even I had to concede that the wait between worthwhile N64 games was just too long. Even for me, the Nintendo age was over, a decade in darkness. I don't know that there was an exact moment in time when I
Decade in
effectively
darkness. His whole world just became it just died.
stopped playing video games. I just know that it happened. I don't recall a single moment when I simply said I'm done, especially since I never really fully quit cold turkey. All I can say for sure is that at one moment the vast majority of my free time was spent playing, reading about, and thinking about video games. And then it wasn't anymore. Despite its place in the overall narrative, I honestly don't feel like it was strictly a result of the first age of Nintendo coming to a close for my generation, though I imagine it helped. The first sign of it was that I was spending more time dwelling in the gaming community than I was actually playing the games. Reading about the launch of Nintendo Power's America online site was my introduction to the concept of internet chat rooms and message boards, and it spurred me, and, with some nudging, my family, to finally get a good internet connection so that I might use them. I devoured the world of the early internet, particularly gaming sites. The hours once spent replaying my favorite games were replaced by hours of chatting and arguing about new ones. A new normal of gaming developed in my house. I learned about games, and my younger brother and sister did the playing. Mostly, though, it was a semi-unconscious decision about time management. High school had me focused on my career prospects soon. 47, Super Mario Bros. 3, brick by brick enough I'd have my first job, clerking for a Blockbuster. My other internet fixation, movie sites, had reawakened my other geek passion for filmmaking in a major way. For the first time I had a career path that seemed more attractive and more plausible than game design. Get into the movies. Writing, directing, special effects, maybe even criticism, just get into the movies. With all this on my plate, something had to give. And somewhere along the line video games became that something. Thing is, as much as I was leaving games behind, it felt as though they were also leaving me behind. Gaming was rapidly changing from a geek subculture to something like the mainstream, and with more of my attention diverted elsewhere I recognized it less and less every time I looked. Even Nintendo wasn't.
It got away from me. It just went along. It just was it was a disaster. It was stuff like that. It's just so insane. Like just how much this fucked him over as a kid. I'm sorry I'm not commenting too much on this. I think it kind of speaks for itself. So just going.
Wasn't the Nintendo.
So I'm just letting it play.
Nintendo I'd grown up with. They had a new cash cow, Pokemon, which had crossed over into a mainstream phenomenon bigger and faster than Mario ever had. To a new generation of gamers, Pikachu, not Mario, was the face of the medium, and so, that was that. My brother bought the GameCube, Nintendo's successor to the N64, making it the first Nintendo console other than the Virtual Boy I didn't own myself. The Cube had Mario games of its own, Luigi's Mansion, where Mario's brother fought ghosts, Wario World, and, as a piece, Super Mario Sunshine, which upended traditional Mario gameplay by giving him a water cannon weapon for cleaning up villainous graffiti. It's complicated, in a tropical setting. I played and enjoyed these games, but whether it was them or me, the spell was well and truly broken. I just didn't have the burning desire to come back. Instead, my college and film pursuits filled my time. Working at Blockbuster.
It's just like, yeah, I mean, Nintendo went through a kind of GameCube. There was a lot of good stuff. Maybe it's just because he didn't play any of them, but there was lots of good third-party games for it. There was what was it again? There's Bane Kados. By the way, guys, Bane Kados has come out on Steam. I don't know why they decided to release a remastered version of Bane Kados on Steam, but they did. 1 and 2, which is awesome. One of my favorite games. There was Tales of Symphonia. There was, I guess, Custom Robo is a first party game. What else did they have on GameCube? There was a lot of other good games on GameCube.
Blockbuster, and then Suncoast Video, and then Blockbuster again, helped me channel my growing film vocabulary into a useful job skill, but more importantly it afforded me the ability to make friends of co-workers. These turned out to be the most genuine and lasting friendships I'd had in my life thus far. And
I'm gonna file this under shit that never happened. Just shit that never happened. Oh, this is giving me flashbacks. So, I had a best friend from basically grade 4 until like grade 12. And one time when I was in university, I was hanging out with him over the summer, and I made fun of gypsies, and I complained about immigrants. And he just said, I don't want to be your friend anymore. And it ended like a decade-long friendship. And I considered him basically like a brother. But he had become a shitlib, and that was more important to him. So.
far, and a particular assemblage of pals culled from that first Blockbuster job became a posse of like-minded movie buffs with whom I started an independent filmmaking outfit. Today, several of them are frequent collaborators in the production of the Game Over Thinker. A second collection of friends came from Suncoast.
Another one of my best friends in university basically broke it off with me. It was kind of both ways because I started to become a Christian. And he just was extremely like abrasive about his atheism. And then two of my last friends from university unfriended me got angry, like threw me under the bus because I supported Trump. And I have one good friend left over from my university days, and that was Abstract Entity, who's still around and has a YouTube channel.
Suncoast, and it was through them that I wound up reviving a small sliver of my gaming life after several years going cold.
I was really fucked up, though, at that time of my life. I couldn't really emotionally regulate stuff like that. I don't know. It was a very dark time period for me. That and then the Argent unemployment arc and stuff like that. Eventually, though, when I converted to Catholicism, I went to therapy. I got diagnosed properly. I started taking bipolar meds, and then I got lucky with a job opportunity, and my life just got a lot better. And I'm a lot more emotionally and mentally stable now than I used to be. I live in like another province than my parents. I have a career. I have an apartment. I have a cat. I don't really regret any of the stuff that happened because it made me the person I am today. And I don't think I could really be anybody else. Maybe that's kind of a weird thing to say, but it kind of is literally how it is.
Cold, or, at least, lukewarm, turkey. Hanging out with them, the frequent activity of choice was firing up one of the GameCube Mario Party titles. The series reached 7 installments during its time on the Cube, or the game that had turned out to be the system's most enduring title, Super Smash Bros. Melee, an improvement on the original whose potency as a Nintendo 48 Bob Chipman nostalgia injection was even effective on an abstainer like me. It was in this way that I discovered what had been happening to my old digital friends while I'd been away. The GameCube had failed to make a real impact in a market now dominated by a new console war between Sony's PlayStation 2 and Microsoft's Xbox, an American console? What madness was this? But it was thriving as the console of choice for party games like these. I would come to learn that GameCubes were a common fixture of college dorm life. I was going to a local state college and commuting from home to save money, so communal collegiate life was somewhat lost on me. To a generation of younger gamers picking up the cube habit from the collegiate older siblings, Mario and company were becoming better known as the fighting roster of Melee than as heroes of their own games. Meanwhile, my second blockbuster job led me to...
He probably got fired from his first one because he was such a loser he couldn't even hold down a job at Blockbuster. I've talked it a lot of times that the job that I got in, I think it was grade 9, was at a movie theater. And that's kind of where I got into film because our benefit was we got unlimited movies, so we could go see a movie whenever we wanted. I would often just go see anything. As I've said many times, I don't really get out that much. I didn't really have that many friends or anything to do on Friday or Saturday nights, so I would often just go see a movie or something like that. After my my shift was over, I'd often go see a movie. Just stuff like that. It's where I really started to kind of develop a passion for film.
Me to what seemed at the time like a stroke of great fortune. An older gentleman, who will remain nameless, came in asking if he could leave some flyers. Turns out, he was starting up a film criticism show for local cable access television and was looking for on-air talent. Store policy said I had to tell him no, but it said nothing about me volunteering for the position myself. After a set of meetings and conversations, I was hired to do the show along with this person and a female co-host. The resulting show was what you would expect from local cable, but it was exposure and a chance to work on my craft, such as it was. I was the colorful member of the team, the younger guy with the wild opinions and the deeper film knowledge. It was a fun time. While it lasted, I'd never gotten much of a sense that anything was especially off about the guy running the show. I knew he was fairly conservative, politically ex-military and an ex-cop, but it had never come up in any kind of negative way. But upon the release of Mel Gibson's The Passion of Christ and the controversy surrounding it, something seemed to change in him. I was fairly certain both co-hosts knew that I'd seen the film and hadn't cared for it, and expected it would make a good show when we sat down to review it. Instead, I got a phone call, and an unnervingly scary life experience. My employer, though, for the record, I wasn't technically being paid for my services on the show.
Okay, this is where his based BoomerCon boss just completely blows him out. And he becomes a shit lib. This is really fucking based.
Summoned me to a meeting in his van, in an empty parking lot early in the morning. He did freelance security work, or he said he did, at least, and was on the job. This set off more red flags than I could count, but I showed up to meet him. He presented me with a printout of a scathing blog review I'd posted after seeing the film the first time, and wanted to know what I had against Jesus Christ. Unwisely, I offered that my objection was to the anti-Semitism in the film and was told those people had Schindler's Lists. Now this is our turn.
So based boomer man just completely blows him out. Fires him for disrespecting Jesus. This is so cool.
Those people had Schindler's Lists. Now this is our turn. I was then told, 49, Super Mario Bros. 3, brick by brick, that he would be using the Passion discussion as an occasion to promote the film's positive message, and that if I wouldn't go along, by saying I liked the movie, my time on the show would be over, and that was that. I never heard from the guy again.
So fucking based. I'm gonna be honest, I watched Passion of the Christ when I was like in on the whole new atheism thing and I was a fedora and I hated it back then. I probably would like it now, but I just gonna admit that I was into like Richard Dawkins and that stuff back in the day. I know it's cringe. I blame it as having grown up in the United Church, which is like a more liberal. It's like a low church version of the Episcopal Church. So I was never very well catechized.
No, his show didn't last long without me. I'm told he'd behaved in a manner, because it's hearsay I won't get into specifics, that disturbed the production staff during the taping of the Passion episode, and that my name had come up, which had me walking around more than a little paranoid for a few weeks. But nothing ever came of it. My time in
Okay, so I'm gonna say this. What do you think the odds are that this is just completely made up and he said something way worse? Like he said that like he did some like fedora Richard Dawkins take that like people who believe in Christ are stupid. They like believe in Santa Claus. That he said all kinds of like horrendous shit. Like what are the odds of that versus yeah.
My time at Blockbuster, number 2, ended soon after that, around 2005, if I recall correctly. But
He got fired from Blockbuster twice. Once again, I just want to put this out to you guys. I think there's some unreliable narrator tropes going on here, which, given how bad this book makes him look, really says something.
correctly, but my ongoing friendship with a co-worker from the first Blockbuster was able to finagle me a job with him at Best Buy, where I soon found myself moved from a morbid grind in the appliances department. Yes, we can swap the hinges on that fridge. Yes, the ice maker needs to be hooked up to a water supply to the DVD, music and video games department that was in those days the profit-driving centerpiece of any big electronics store. By then I'd been selling movies for almost a decade, and while my time away from the medium left me a little shaky on the names and faces, who are all these people and creatures on the Xbox and PS2 boxes? The skill set translated to selling games pretty handily. As you'll no doubt intuit, it was hard to be around video games even as a salesman and not be drawn back toward them. But,
He's like bragging about being able to sell video games during the 2000s. Like he's like, "Oh, I was able to sell video games like a boss."
in truth, I'd been nudging my way back for a while by then. It had been, for sure, many years since there'd been a game console hooked up to my TV. The NES and SNES were sitting, along with stacks of their games, in a box somewhere in the back of a closet. The N64 was living in my sister's room. My brother had the GameCube and PS2 at college. But gaming had changed in my absence, and one of those changes had been that the console in your room was no longer the sole home of the serious gamer. And this change had been led by some old friends. I don't think I ever came right out and said I'm done with Mario, but even if I had, it turned out he wasn't done with me. Daybreak, for most of my time between the Blockbuster number 2 and Best Buy eras of employment.
Okay, I'm gonna do this.
So, Chip.
Oh no, where is it? Okay, here we go.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
There we go.
Employment, part of my regular schedule included weekend nighttime hangouts with my Suncoast originating group of friends, which almost always involved playing some video games. Halo and Halo 2 on the Xbox were the games of choice at first, not my favorite thing, but shooting is fun. But soon at 50, Bob Chipman was discovered that the GameCube Mario Party titles and Super Smash...
I'm just assuming whenever he says friends, that part is owed in. Like, who would want to be friends with movie Bob Chipman?
Super Smash Brothers. Melee were better compatible with half-drunken revelry. But as much as enjoyed them in that context, I didn't rush out to get my own copies. It was something I did over those guys' house. What it did spur me to do was start paying more attention to my own games department and spend more time browsing gaming sites online and game stores during mall walks. And it was during one such jaunt of casual browsing that something extraordinary caught my eye: boxes labeled NES Classics, with vintage-style cover art advertising that they contained direct ports of NES-era games for the Game Boy Advance.
Oh, dude, we're a quarter into this. We haven't even got into the book yet. This book is not very long, and like, we're, 50 pages in, and we haven't actually gotten to brick by brick yet.
Advance. Their presence made me smile, but by then I'd gotten used to the idea of Golden Age ports on new systems. What I saw next to them, though, would have induced an honest-to-God spit take had I been drinking anything at the time: a Game Boy Advance, Advance SP, if you want to be technical about it, painted and art designed to resemble an NES. I had to have it. Impulsive, yes, but I was unable to resist the opportunity to carry the good old days in my pocket. Now, I needed games.
The good old days in his pocket. Happier times. The only time in Movie Bob's life that he's happy. Is this like Citizen Kane? Is Mario like Rosebud the sled?
Games. What I'd managed to miss during my break was that, while Mario and the rest of the Nintendo menagerie had slipped from the top shelves of the console scene, their power and influence had grown 1,000-fold in the realm of handhelds. The Game Boy brand had run the show effectively unchallenged for so many cycles that it still had potency in the age of Nintendo's newer handheld, the DS, and game stores were filled with used, low-priced GB and GBA games. I gorged myself on such games, discovering to my delight that the persistent tech limits of small handhelds meant that this particular gaming landscape was awash in polished continuations of my beloved 8 and 16-bit eras. And there were Mario games, lots of Mario games. Re-releases of the classics, the two land titles I still had from before, and even Mario and Luigi, Superstar Saga, which played like an even more satirical follow-up to Super Mario RPG. GBA, and soon enough a DS, was my constant companion, particularly useful for passing time sitting in the car after work, waiting for the rest of the house to go to sleep before heading home.
Now this is one of the most like depressing lines in the whole thing. Like, he didn't want to go home. He didn't want to go home because his family was so ashamed about him. So he would spend all like night in the parking lot playing Mario until he was certain that they had gone to sleep, and then he snuck home so that like the shame wouldn't transfer.
Home. I promise that last part isn't actually as sad as it sounds. You see, around the same time I had picked up another hobby, making silly videos on the internet. I'd acquired some basic editing software with a new camcorder at one point, and had gotten reasonably good at using it in my college film classes. Those days were the Wild West for web video connections, just fast enough to make it workable, legality just slow enough to make things wide open. Putting videos together scratched my filmmaking itch a second. 51, Super Mario Bros. 3, Brick by Brick Movie Project.
Like, is this supposed to be nostalgic? Is this supposed to be people like I don't know what it is. This thing is really like fucking depressing.
Project with my blockbuster crew had blown up in my face somewhat, but still living at home meant the only times I could have enough quiet and computer access to actually make use of it was when everyone else had hit the sack.
Wow. So he was so ashamed of the shitty YouTube videos he was making that he had to sit in the parking lot of the Best Buy or Blockbuster or wherever he was working, and sit in the Blockbuster or where he's working and play until people went to bed so he could go home and hide it from his parents.
I was getting pretty good at
You're right, Good Old Boys podcast. This could be a good remake of Taxi Driver.
Good at cutting together silly mock trailers, but I had far greater amusement watching the more polished shows
Is Movie Bob an antediluvian king, or is he too recent for that?
Shows other guys were putting out. James Rolfe, another aspiring movie maker, was transforming into an internet-age celebrity as the angry Nintendo nerd almost overnight, establishing excitable Gen Z rants about obscure stuff from a slasher childhood as the most popular web video genre going. A few years later, a British-born Australian gamer named Yahtzee Crawshaw became overnight the first...
His accent just triggers me. I gotta be honest, British accents like that just trigger me.
I'd like to say that I saw my future then. Struck by visions of a new path forward by a beam of sunlight down from heaven. But the truth is, I didn't have the slightest inkling that I might have stumbled into a useful career outlet for both my, thus far, useless multimedia and film studies degrees and my gradually reawakening video game fixation. My mind was focused elsewhere, both at work and at play. I'd come back to Mario and Nintendo fandom, but as a nostalgia infusion, something to keep on the memory shelf with He-Man and Little League trophies, and then, something started to stir. What's old is new. As it turned out, I wasn't the only Generation NES 20-something using the 20-something...
The thing is, I actually, after I did this, I watched, his reviews are actually not bad. Like, his movie reviews are actually, like, decent. Bizarrely enough. Like, he's talking about, like, the only good thing in this dude's life. Like, he had a useless degree. He was living with his parents. He was working at Best Buy. They were so ashamed of him, he had to sit in the parking lot playing Game Boy Advance SD until they were asleep so he could sneak home and hide the shame of his hobby of making YouTube videos from his parents. Like, this is rough.
20-something using Nintendo handhelds to reconnect with the burgeoning retro scene. Publishers were seeing the numbers. Alongside re-releases, new games cast in the old-school style started to fill up the shelves. In 2005, Nintendo themselves got in on the act in a big way though. Surprisingly, it wasn't Mario himself who'd lead the charge. Instead, the first wholly new Mario Universe side-scroller in almost a decade, excluding the Wario Land sub-franchise, and even those releases had slowed to a crawl, would be 2005's Super Princess Peach, which, as the title implies, took the long-overdue step of having Princess Peach do the fighting herself to rescue a kidnapped Mario and Luigi.
I'm gonna be honest, I actually really like Super Princess Peach. Maybe I'm the only person who likes it, but I had a lot of fun with that. It's probably actually my favorite platformer Mario game, which I know is going to be heretical, but like I said, I'm not very good at them, and that one was a lot easier.
Luigi. Then, 1 year later, the man himself returned. New Super Mario Bros. Used rendered sprites and upgrade of the 52 Bob Chipman similar technology employed by Donkey Kong Country on the SNES, and bumped the character models up to their present-day incarnations, but otherwise represented a back-to-basics approach, a classic side-scroller modeled primarily on SMB1. Linear levels, mushroom flower star power-ups, though the mushrooms now came in extra small and significantly bigger varieties, and Bowser castles at the end of each level to conquer. And while it might not have blown the minds of long-time devotees, see below, it more than succeeded at its goal of giving both original fans and newbies who'd come up on the re-releases and Mario Party titles something that was at once new and familiar. And the sales spoke for themselves. It was one of the biggest hits ever released for the DS. In all honesty, when judged against the rest of the series, NSMB probably falls in the average zone. It's a solid game, how could it not be, with Nintendo EAD, the company's top-tier in-house development outfit, having had about 20 years to perfect the formula? But I'll admit to feeling a small tinge of that's it. Upon first playing through, it may have been an issue of expectations, that is, me hoping for something that picked up where World and Yoshi's Island left off, whereas Nintendo was looking to polish up the original diamond. But if you'd told me that this amusing, glossy revival game signaled the beginning of a full-fledged rebirth for Mario and Nintendo, I would have written it off as wishful thinking. I would have been wrong. Revolution. My reborn gaming habit had been focused almost exclusively on handhelds, so I hadn't been paying much attention outside of work to the console scene. I knew the Xbox 360 and PS3 were en route and set to muck up the HD DVD Blu-ray war that was already making a mess of my job, and I knew that Nintendo had a new console codenamed
So I think we're going to stop it here because I have some other stuff I want to go do. I'll continue this. It might take another session or two to get through. We'll see how much we can take of the actual like brick by brick part. Because honestly, it's really bad. It's the actual brick by brick. It's funny at first, but it gets pretty awful. So yeah, I'm having a lot of fun doing this. This will obviously be up as a video on demand. God bless everybody, and we'll have lots more exciting content to come, including a continuation of this.